In the very early lore of the Jedi Order, one of the founders of the Jedi High Council would fall to the dark side, and today we'll explain his story. The Jedi High Council was always supposed to serve the Order as a beacon of authority, and to set an example for what all young Jedi should strive for. The High Council typically contained the strongest and wisest members of the Order in any given era. It was exceedingly rare for any members of the Council to fall to the dark side, but it turns out that one of the very first Council members in the very history of the Jedi turned to the dark side and became a Dark Jedi. His name was Master Rajavari, and he was one of the most powerful and influential Jedi of his era, or should we say, the ancient Jedi era. The year was 25,800 BBY. In the ancient days of the Jedi Order, this one master would be a founding member of what would become the High Council, and yet his legacy is not one which remembers his great wisdom or developments in the Force, but rather how he poisoned the minds of a group of Jedi learners and went out in a blaze of glory. So let us open a holocron and look into the scandalous history of the Jedi Order and study the life of Master Rajavari. But before we begin, we have had a terrible premonition in the Force. Many who visit and use our archives have not yet subscribed to our order, so if you've been enjoying the daily holocron uploads and openings, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. Now acolytes, let us begin. Anytime a Jedi falls to the dark side, it is a tragic event, especially if they're a Jedi Master. But this one was especially heart-wrenching when we know exactly who Rajavari was. Master Rajavari was a well-respected Jedi Master within the Jedi Order, known for being extremely wise and strong. In fact, he would be a general in the first two wars ever fought by the Jedi, the Despot War and the Force War. The Despot War had been an event where the queen by the name of Hadia of a nearby system had put together a massive army in order to conquer the planets in her shared system, uniting them all under one rulership. The ancient Jedi decided to intervene since it involved them as well, causing a massive war to break out on the world of Tython. Jedi Master Rajavari would first gain prominence when he served as a general during this war, and would win several key victories for the Jedi. The war would come to a violent end though, when the Jedi Ranger, Dagan Locke, would murder the Queen, and the whole event put the Jedi in a tense place, with many still on high alert for years after the incident, since this was one of the first times the Jedi had marched to war. Master Rajavari, having been disturbed by his time in the war, desired seclusion in order to meditate on the balance of the Force, achieving it once more, feeling as if his inner scales had tipped during the bloodshed. Jedi Master Rajavari laid down his weapon and went off in isolation to the temple known as Akar Kesh. Several years would pass when one of his former students by the name of Ketu came to the Jedi Master for advice. Ketu informed Rajavari that Dagan Locke had seen terrible visions of a dark warrior wielding a sword of fire that would arrive on Tython, and Rajavari warned his apprentice not to disregard Dagan's visions. But unfortunately, many of the Jedi Masters would do just that, sentencing Dagan Locke to imprisonment on the moon of Bogan as he had fallen to the dark side, or so they believed. The visions had driven Dagan Locke insane, and he began to embrace the dark side further. But soon, Ketu would return to Rajavari to inform him that the Dark Warrior with the Sword of Fire had indeed arrived on the planet. This of course being the arrival of the Force Hound known as Kesh. Master Rajavari scolded his former apprentice for not heeding Dagan Locke's mission and beginning the necessary precautions to stop this Dark Warrior, predicting that if one arrived, an army of them may soon follow. Unfortunately, Master Rajavari was correct, predicting the beginning of a long, terrible conflict. Thus began the Force War with the Rakata Empire. Coming out of his isolation, Master Rajavari would lead a contingent of Jedi in the war with the Rakata, helping drive them off of Tython once and for all. And it would be after this event that the Jedi decided to establish a firm council of masters to preside over the Order, ensuring that the Jedi would be more united in their decision-making and not separated. Master Rajavari was among the founding members of this new council, and along with his new title, he began to train the first Jedi lorekeepers, establishing the Fount of Rajavari. The Fount of Rajavari was basically the first incantation of what would become the Jedi Archives. Simply put, Rajavari was extremely important to the very structure of the Jedi that we know today, as all of the knowledge of this period of time would not have been preserved if not for his efforts, nor would there be lore keepers to accurately record all of history. Tragically though, this era of peace would not last very long, as secretly, Rajavari had been growing fascinated with the dark side itself. He could no longer deny its whispers as it called to him in the dark hallways of the temple, in his most vulnerable and private moments. The reason for Master Rajavari's fall is not currently known, making his fall extremely rare among the lore. Fascinated with why this Jedi Council member would fall though, we must look at a few factors, and we have found something. We discovered that he was a Jedi back in the days when the Order hadn't committed to being peacekeepers, or ones to fight the dark side directly. Master Rajavari, like many of the other ancient Jedi, were scholars, one who wanted to seek out the mysteries of the Force, and were not warriors yet. However, they were thrown into a war, one which cost them hundreds of thousands of Jedi lives and lives of innocents. Shortly after this, Master Rajavari's own order decided to imprison a man who had a terrible vision of the future, a vision that came true. The result was yet another war and mess that he had to clean up. Forced to come out of the self-chosen exile in order to fight against the first real dark side threat the Jedi had ever faced, Rajavari stared directly into the abyss, and the abyss stared back. Let's also not forget that the Jedi at this time were also using the Force Sabers, requiring them to use the dark side to activate them. Rajavari was on record not wanting to wield the Force Saber in combat, so now, having been thrust into darkness and seeing the horrors of war with no escape more than once, his mind was lost. Following his fall, Rajavari would lead a section of the Jedi students into the darkness with him, and they all became some of the first recorded Dark Jedi, apart from Dagan Locke, of course. Rajavari sought to destroy the very Jedi Order that he had built, so that he could remake it in his own image. The Master established a set of key principles for his students to abide by, all of which ran contrary to the Jedi's virtues. While we don't know each of them in order, we do know the second principle: all life is a battle, even to the last breath. And the seventh principle, to sacrifice strength, is the act of a fool. Both of these are clearly products of Rajavari's trauma from war. The second principle shows his extremist survival mentality, and the seventh shows us how he rejected the Jedi way of self-sacrifice after seeing all of his brothers die. However, it was his fifth principle which remains the most controversial. Mercy creates a spiral of destruction. Jedi are encouraged to be merciful. This principle shows that if a Jedi is to show mercy for those who do not comprehend it, such as a violent predator for example, this can cause great harm or harm in the future. Rajavari went off the deep end and believed that mercy was a fool's bargain no matter the situation. He saw his enemies as subhuman, mindless animals waiting to gut you, a product of having to fight the ravenous Rakata. His time and teachings as a Dark Jedi would not last very long though, as the Jedi Order would swiftly respond to this issue and stamp out the darkness. Rajavari and his students would follow the second principle and fight until the very last breath. The final stand of this corrupted, wretched order would be held in the fortress of Caleth, as the Dark Jedi had fled there. The Jedi Order laid siege to the fortress for a long time, until Rajavari finally fell in battle. His students refused to surrender even after their master had fallen, deciding to adhere to his principles even till death, and they would all fall to the Jedi, one by one, in vicious battle. However, this is not the end of the story of Master Rajavari, as he was so powerful that he had learned to keep himself from joining with the Force upon his death. He became a Force ghost, and his spirit lingered in the hidden fount of Rajavari, awaiting the day that a worthy disciple would come and become the heir to all of his knowledge. Thousands of years later, during the Cold War when the Jedi had returned to Tython, a young Jedi by the name of Naylan fell to the dark side, seeking out the teachings of the ancient Rajavari. He managed to find the fount of Rajavari and move through all of the traps that the Master had set behind. Each of these traps were meant to test the Seeker to see if they had truly adhered to his teachings. However, Nayland had to just walk right through them instead of solving them. This caused him to suffer greatly, as the tests ended up driving him insane, and when he eventually found the ghost of Rajavari, he inherited all of the knowledge and set off to destroy the Jedi, something even more grotesque than Rajavari had become. A Padawan who was following Nayland ended up making it through the traps as well, and communed with the spirit of Rajavari. And it's here when the Force Spirit expresses his remorse for having given his knowledge to the young Nayland. Rajavari admits that he wanted to create a successor, but instead created a real monster. His traps had warped Nayland's mind, and now he wanted to destroy the Jedi instead of remake it. Rajavari had never wanted the Jedi to die out entirely. He wanted them to become better, stronger, more like him. Nayland attempted to first destroy, though, the Great Forge, crippling the Jedi. The Forge, where all of the lightsabers were constructed, and this would strip the Jedi of their martial power and leave them vulnerable to attack. The ghost of Rajavari, however, would help the Padawan in finding and stopping Nayland before it was too late. Following this, the Jedi Padawan would speak softly to the old master Rajavari, convincing him to come to peace and to pass on through the Force, accepting where he was wrong, and finally achieving the rest that he desired in life. In the end, Master Rajavari was amazingly wise, powerful, and influential. He was not the typical Dark Jedi who only wanted destruction and acted like a madman. He was well-spoken, thoughtful, and calm. He established many things in the structure of the Jedi which have lasted to this very day in the lore, and his intention was to cleanse the Jedi and make them stronger. However, he had been warped by trauma of 2 wars, ones that he begged not to have to participate in. He was angered by the short-sightedness of his peers, but in the end, he showed great sadness and remorse for having led a young Jedi to attempt to destroy the Order that he truly loved deep down. He redeemed himself by helping the Padawan take down Nayland, preserving the Jedi, and passing on through the Force. And so, my friends, this was the story of the first Jedi Council member who fell to the dark side. What was the extremely rare lightsaber form invented by Yoda's species? Greetings, Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. We have always known very little about Yoda's species, with the most reliable fact we know being that they are exceptionally powerful in the Force. It's our current understanding that every member of Yoda's species is not only innately Force sensitive, but that they have a connection to it that is far beyond anything seen in other species. However, it seems the trade-off for this amazing potential and long life is that they are not physically gifted. They are very short and physically weak, always having to make adjustments to their lifestyle in order to measure up to the world that surrounds them, which brings us neatly to their approach to combat. While we don't often see Jedi of Yoda's species actively entering into a battle, whenever the need arises, they always seem to have a unique way of tackling their enemy. And in today's holocron, we are going to be analyzing the extremely rare lightsaber form that was invented by a member of Yoda's species for that very purpose. So, Acolytes, let us open a holocron and begin. Before though, we upload holocrons every single day, so if you've been enjoying the daily Star Wars lore, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny, we have foreseen it. The lightsaber form that we'll be breaking down today is when one fights with their lightsaber telekinetically. Despite seeming like this could be something any Jedi could do and should be doing, we have really only ever seen 2 beings do this consistently in the lore to the point of making it their natural form in combat. Interestingly, this lightsaber style doesn't actually have a name like most of the other techniques do, but it is simply referred to as kinetic combat. We trace the origins of kinetic combat to a member of Yoda's species, one who lived during the time of Revan and the Old Republic. This member of Yoda's species was Vandar Tokare, and he to this day remains one of the most mysterious of the 6 members of Yoda's species that are named in the lore. Unlike many of the other members, Master Vandar speaks with a plain dialect instead of the backwards way that the others typically do. Yaddle in canon also speaks plainly, but for a long time in Legends she didn't. But we digress. Vandar is also the only one who has olive skin that looks more human than the shades of green shared with his brethren. And to top it all off, Vandar is the only member of Yoda's species that has shared their surname with the wider galaxy. Vandar Tokare sticks out in so many categories that it almost doesn't seem surprising that for his final staple of individuality, he invented one of the most challenging lightsaber forms ever. Like Yoda, Vandar was a master of Form 4 Ataru, but as the Jedi got older, he began to withdraw from the physical aspects of combat, choosing mostly to remain on capital ships and give commands to Republic fleets. However, when he did enter battle himself, he wielded 2 green Shoto lightsabers and dueled exclusively using telekinesis, using the lightsabers apart from himself. It should be noted that we are not entirely certain whether or not Vandar actually invented kinetic combat. However, this form is not seen used by anyone before this time, and the only other person to use it in the lore and legends is Kreia, who existed at the same time that Vandar did. This means that it's likely that she studied his lightsaber form and adopted it for her own use much later. This actually makes sense, because Kreia too had been a Jedi consular, and not only that, but a Jedi historian. While there aren't any records that indicate she specifically trained under Master Tokare, Kreia would have respected him enough to study him as well as his species. And since we know that Kreia herself is also incredibly talented with the Force in many aspects, especially telekinesis, it gives credence to the fact that she is able to use kinetic combat. Kreia actually took it a step further though, by wielding 3 full-length purple lightsabers at once. The clear question here is, why don't Force users employ this technique? The strength of kinetic combat are quite plain. Being able to manipulate multiple lightsabers through telekinesis alone allows one to attack at a range, with Vandar being capable of sending his lightsabers to fight for him up to 60 feet away. This would also theoretically allow one to conserve their own physical energy for further situations, while having a near-perfect balance of defense and offense. Their limbs are safe from the ever-present threat of dismemberment, and it is extremely difficult for an opponent to land a single hit, as even if one is able to penetrate the barriers of the floating blades, the puppeteer of these lightsabers still has time to move out of the way. In a way, kinetic combat might just be one of the most overpowered ways to use a lightsaber next to Trakata, but just like that discouraged form, it also has its weaknesses which are equally glaring. It is not perfect. There is a question of whether one even has the capability to do it in the first place. On the surface, kinetic combat seems like something that any Force wielder should be capable of, simply using telekinesis and the lightsaber, but it's far more complex than that. The sheer amount of a focus and concentration that it takes for a Force wielder to lift an object, then manipulate it with the same speed and precision as they do with their own hand and lightsaber is extremely difficult. Yoda did say that size doesn't matter, but the accuracy in which an object is used is an entirely different animal. The subtle gestures, spins, movements, and parries in lightsaber combat are challenging enough, but taking the physicality completely out of that and only using the Force is nigh impossible. Translating all of one's strengths purely telekinetically is again also nearly impossible. Like using the Force to keep an entire machine running with each of its individual parts. One's focus has to be magnified on their lightsaber and each of his movements all of the time. Now multiply that by 2 or even 3 weapons. In a duel, they must also be aware of their opponent and their next step, aware of their surroundings, and even subtle changes in the Force. Not only that, but they have to passively concentrate on making sure that their own Force shield stays intact so that an opponent cannot just grab their lightsabers out of the air. With all of this in mind, we still haven't even gotten to the fact that Force wielders still need to remember how to move around properly while in combat should they need to dodge or gain better footing. It is nearly impossible for anyone short of Jedi Masters with decades of experience to accomplish any of this. And then we have to factor in their natural talent with telekinesis, because some Jedi simply aren't as naturally attuned with it. Kreia and Vandar were certainly far more adept at telekinesis than most beings, which allowed them to do this in the first place. Even if one were to train for a lifetime, one lapse in concentration will cause the lightsabers to react a second too slow, giving an opponent the opportunity to leap in and strike at the user's completely undefended body. And while earlier we said that they could just move out of the way, there is still the possibility that they react too slowly due to having their entire focus on their lightsaber. Kinetic combat is not something that is as straightforward as it sounds, because it literally brings even the most powerful Force wielders' concentration to their very limit of power, leaving them exposed in many areas. Even powerful people like Sidious and Nihilus could potentially do this without too many problems, do not because of the risks. None of this is to say that kinetic combat is in any way a bad form to use though, as it is extremely effective, but the ability to master it should not be understated whatsoever, especially on such a fine-tuned level like this. Having said that, we wanted to bring this back to Vandar Tokare himself, and talk about how interesting it is that each of the members of Yoda's species have preferences in lightsaber combat to make up for their own physical shortcomings. Yoda himself became a master of Ataru on a level never seen before. He was able to simply jump and climb over all of his opponents, slip their guards effortlessly, or overwhelm them with a storm of blows before they knew what was happening with overwhelming strength. Yarael became a master of many esoteric powers. She was adapted to Terminus on Yoda's level and knew the ways of Morchiro, the power to slow someone's vital signs with the Force itself. While this isn't shown in canon, we likely can summarize that Yarael was not trying to harm Dooku in their duel, and of course, Vandar decided to not even be bothered entering a fight physically, but instead, he chose to wield his lightsabers with the Force so that he could reach his opponent when he could not. Vandar, being of a smaller stature, actually works in his favor with kinetic combat. We said earlier that should the opponent manage to pierce the wall of the sabers, that it would leave the user exposed. But for Vandar Tokare, as such a small target, it made even more challenging for his enemy to strike him down. The opponent would have to overextend themselves to get at him in any way, giving Vandar an opening with his floating weapons to strike them down. Not to mention, Vandar was extremely long-lived, just like Yoda. He had multiple lifespans to perfect kinetic combat to the point where it was likely as second nature to him as fighting with his hands would be. All in all, kinetic combat is one of those techniques that many believe to be overpowered, but may not know the intricacies that would make it completely ineffectual in the hands of an inexperienced wielder. Anytime a lightsaber leaves the hand of a Jedi, it usually means they are performing a saber throw. In this way, they can use simple nudges with telekinesis to keep the lightsaber spinning and then return it to their hand. But even doing this is met with warning from blade masters, as it leaves one without their weapon for a split second. But anyway, my friends, who was the only Jedi Master, or Force wielder for that matter, to wield a brown lightsaber in all of the lore? Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. The subject of kyber crystals and the varying types of lightsaber colors is one that's revisited frequently by many scholars of a galaxy far, far away. Anytime we come across a strange color, we just can't help but analyze its possible meanings and significance. Well, today, we bring you a rather bizarre one. During the ancient days of the Jedi Order, there was a master of a rare species by the name of Bnar, and in his time, he wielded the only known brown lightsaber that we are aware of in the entirety of the lore. Master Bnar was a member of the Neti, a long-lived race that evolved from trees. They were, in essence, living plant people, which were often Force-sensitive and high in tune with the light side. Those of you familiar with the channel will recognize this as being the species of Master Tre Sa, the female Neti, which trained Mace Windu. But Master Bnar was a very interesting and unique Jedi indeed, and his particular studies as a master may reveal why he had a brown kyber crystal. But before we begin, we have had a premonition in the Force. Many individuals that have used our archives have not yet subscribed to our order, so if you've been enjoying the daily Star Wars Holocron uploads, reach out and crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. We have foreseen it. But back to Master Bnar and his brown crystal. Due to the extremely long life of a Neti, it is difficult to say exactly when Master Bnar was born, but he was originally from the planet of Reich, but was stranded on his people's native world of Merkur, where he would grow into young adulthood. At some point, he was eventually found by the Jedi Order and brought in for training, discovering his high Force sensitivity. By 5000 BBY, Bnar had become a Jedi Knight, where he observed the events of the Great Hyperspace War. We say observed because he was one of those who didn't participate. However, he did find a passion which would shape his studies as a Jedi. This would be the study of the Sith and the dark side. Master Bnar became a scholar, and would eventually become the understudy of Master Odan another long-lived Jedi who fought during the war against Naga Sadow. Master Bnar worked with Odan in the archives, gathering and studying the history and all knowledge pertaining to the Sith Order. Interestingly, Bnar never felt any sort of pull to the dark side in any form from his studies. Oftentimes in lore, our stories begin with a Jedi with a fascination in the dark side, with them eventually turning to it and embracing it fully. But Master Bnar never felt anything from his studies, making him one of the most unique Jedi scholars in all of history. As a Nedi, he possessed an incredibly rare ability which allowed him to completely sever himself from the subject matter that he was studying. By approaching the Sith lore from a place of complete disconnection, he was quite literally deaf to the dark side, while still being able to comprehend and understand it. As a result of these groundbreaking studies, Bnar became a revered Jedi within the Order, and soon he would be the go-to source for any Jedi that required information about the dark side. While nothing of a fighter himself, and a self-proclaimed poor military tactician, Bnar was always eager to share his knowledge with other Jedi so that he could be useful in the fight against the dark side and its affiliates in some degree. During this time in galactic history, knowledge of the dark side and the Sith was extremely rare. The only run-ins the Jedi had with such things was back during the Second Great Schism, and a few times the Sith Order had returned since then, including Naga Sadow's invasion. So they encountered dark acolytes, or when the Jedi had to go take care of Freed and Nad, they would heavily rely on Bnar's knowledge in order to prepare. Along with his studies into Sith lore, Bnar was also very familiar with Kyber crystal science. He was one of the masters in charge of the study along with Odan. In fact, rare crystals weren't something that was strange to Bnar. Apparently he had once gifted his apprentice, Shaylay Nur, a Solari crystal, one that could be used in her own lightsaber. At the time, the Solari crystal was the rarest and the most powerful Jedi Kyber crystal that had ever been discovered, producing a light orange blade. The Solari crystal could only be used by a Jedi who was pure in spirit, an adherent follower of the light side only. It could not be corrupted by the dark side, and its owner had to always stay pure of heart in order for the lightsaber to function. By the very fact that Bnar once possessed this crystal in his own saber proves that there was no trace of the dark side within him despite all of his studies into the Sith culture. I think this perfectly brings us around to the crystal known as Bnar's Sacrifice, which is the brown Kyber crystal that got our attention in the first place in the lore. Very rarely ever used a lightsaber, and for a long time after he gave his Solari crystal away, he didn't even own a lightsaber. But it seems while he never actually used this brown crystal in his own lightsaber, he still had a great love for the crystals, and so he possessed and had imprinted upon it, even though he would never place his crystal in a lightsaber. And fascinatingly, the crystal turned brown. Bnar's Sacrifice, like the Solari crystal, could only ever be used by those who were pure of heart and adamant followers of the light. But this Kyber had one other unique property to it. Whoever uses this crystal in their lightsaber would be bonded to it forever, and the crystal could be used by no other. Bnar would leave this crystal behind as his legacy to any who could come after him, which means that he never used it within his own lightsaber, but wanted someone else to use it in his place for the sake of the Jedi. The meaning of the brown crystal is a curious one, but it's one that we may be able to decipher by studying Master Bnar himself. The hand that wields Bnar's Sacrifice must be one who is pure-hearted and rooted in the light, but they must have a willingness to understand the nature of the dark side without being tempted to use it, or even come close to corruption. It would require a kind of iron will which only comes around every couple thousand years. Only the most special of Jedi could properly use this brown crystal. But on the subject of the crystal's name, it is a tragic one which is appropriately tied to Master Bnar's ultimate fate. Would live until 3996 BBY, being an instrumental help during the Great Sith War against one Exar Kun. Master Bnar provided much required knowledge and advice during the battle with the dark side, and the Jedi were lucky to have him around as the dark side returned to the galaxy in grand fashion. But despite his best efforts, Ulic Qel-Droma still would eventually turn to the dark side, and Bnar's best friend, Odan would eventually be killed directly by Exar Kun. Would succeed as the master of the archives for a short while, until the Battle of Ossus. After the 10-sun Kron cluster would be destabilized by Exar, he invaded Ossus to quickly gather as many Jedi and Sith artifacts from the library as possible, plundering the Jedi's home before the supernova shockwave destroyed the surface of the Jedi's homeworld. Master Bnar was helping everyone get the Jedi knowledge evacuated from the planet when Exar would make his appearance in the archives. Was no fool and knew very well the limits of his own power and skill, and he had no chance against the mighty Sith Lord one-on-one. But he could not, and would not allow the Sith to get his hands on the collection of sacred Jedi lightsabers which resided in the archives, a fascination of Exar's. Bnar would fend off Exar for a short while, doing his best just to dodge the Sith Lord's savage blows. Unfortunately though, Bnar's basic knowledge of lightsaber combat could not stand up to the expertise of Exar Kun, and he was disarmed. However, Bnar held still and held all of the cards as he would activate his species' special trait, a trap he had laid perfectly. Growing over the lightsabers, he became a near indestructible tree, depriving Exar Kun of the sacred lightsaber collection that he so desired. Exar would be forced to flee, knowing that attempting to retrieve the lightsabers would be a waste of time. Master Bnar's old friend, Master Thrawn, would communicate with him before the full evacuation, and the two Jedi Masters would share a solemn goodbye before Thrawn eventually evacuated Ossus himself. The shockwave swept over the surface of the world and destroyed everything. However, Bnar's tree actually withstood the explosion, and he slipped into hibernation over the lightsabers for thousands of years. The crystal, Bnar's sacrifice, was the only legacy that he left behind for one who may claim it years later. During his long slumber, those who were left on Ossus during the devastation began to hide underground, and once it was all over, they all had children, and their descendants would become the Yasana tribe. The Yasana people all grew up knowing the tale of Master Bnar and his tree, as this became a sacred location to them, naming it the Place of Ascension. And it was here where Bnar would rest until he was found by Luke Skywalker in 10 ABY. Luke, who was helping the Yasana people against a dark Jedi. Despite having awoken from a several thousand-year-long slumber, Bnar wasted no time and immediately helped Luke, drawing upon the energies from the planet of Ossus through his very roots. Bnar would counteract a destructive ritual that the Dark Jedi had attempted, officially sacrificing his life in the process, and becoming one with the Force in its finality. This would be the end of Bnar's help. However, long ago, at the behest of Odan and Master Thrawn, Bnar would create a holocron of his own, sharing all of the knowledge of the Sith, the dark side, and his knowledge of kyber crystals. This holocron would survive to the time of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Order, where its knowledge became invaluable to the future of the Jedi. However, it isn't exactly said who found and used the brown kyber crystal known as Bnar's sacrifice. So as far as we know, the brown lightsaber has yet to receive its forever master. So my friends, what do you think of the tale of Master Bnar? These kind of Jedi are extremely important and rare to the overall growth of the Jedi Order, and I think perhaps more Jedi should invest time in learning the ability to completely disassociate from all subject matter that they research, and can learn a healthy amount about the Sith in the process. But let us ask you this question. Was there an ancient Grandmaster stronger than Yoda, and that maybe could have competed with even Luke? Greetings Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. In Star Wars lore, one thing is made very clear. Ancient Force wielders always seem to have a leg up in their competition for the most powerful users, whether they be Jedi or Sith. The secrets they knew were often lost to history, making the subsequent Jedi and Sith orders weaker as a result of this lost information. Over times, we look back at some of the Force wielders which existed thousands of years ago in the lore, and speak of how amazingly powerful they were, while comparing them with who we consider to be today's strongest in the galaxy. But there is one debate that we here at the Archives are not quite sure about yet, and that is the Grandmaster Nomi Sunrider and how she would compare to Grandmaster Yoda. Nomi Sunrider was an ancient Jedi who became Grandmaster of the Order following the death of Exar Kun, but the feat she pulled off during her time as a Jedi has led many to believe that she is even stronger than Yoda is. Well, as you know, we couldn't possibly pass up this discussion, so it was time for our researchers to open up some scrolls and meditate on the truth. So today, join us as we open up a holocron and determine if Nomi Sunrider was truly more powerful than Yoda, making her the most powerful Jedi Grandmaster before Luke. First of all, There may be some of you who are unfamiliar with Nomi, or just may need a refresher, so let's do a quick recap of who she is. Nomi Sunrider was the wife of a Jedi Knight back in the days of the old Sith Wars. This was around the year 4000 BBY, when Jedi were spread out more and more around the galaxy and were allowed to fall in love and have children. On one occasion, Nomi and her husband were at an airport to deliver a bag of kyber crystals to the Jedi Temple on Ossus. However, they were attacked by thugs who wanted the kyber for themselves, and her husband died while protecting his family. In a rage, Nomi picked up his lightsaber and unleashed her devastating potential in the Force, as she slaughtered each and every one of the thugs with her husband's blade. Afterwards, her husband appeared to her as a ghost, instructing her to seek out the Jedi Master Thrawn on the world of Ambria, and it would be there where she would find her training as a Jedi. Although Nomi was frightened by her power and swore off ever using a lightsaber again, she traveled to Ambria and trained under Jedi Master Thrawn. What would happen over the course of the next little while was her learning to overcome her fears and how to hone her extremely strong connection to the Force and insanely devastating powers. The Jedi Knight Nomi would play a pivotal role in the Great Sith War against Exar Kun, and she would even be the one who led the entire Jedi Order in defeating and trapping the spirit of Exar. In the end, she would become Grand Master of the Order, a position that she retained for the remainder of her life. Although Nomi would get over her fear of using a lightsaber and began to wield one quite frequently after the start of the war, she wasn't as proficient with it as some of the other Jedi. That didn't matter to Nomi though, as she much preferred using the Force in combat against Dark Jedi and Sith. A lot of Nomi's raw power would actually come from her master in Thrawn. Thrawn was a quadrupedal animalistic species known to be something of a hermit, and it was said that he knew many secrets about the light side that even members of the Jedi Council did not know. And his claim to fame would be his powers in Force light. He would actually use this to trap and contain a Sith curse inside of a lake on Ambria, and this will be much important to our story later, as this power was something that he passed on to Nomi, who made it her staple ability. But before we jump into that, let's recount some of Nomi's greatest feats. Nomi obviously has far less feats than someone like Yoda, but they are impactful and a huge testament to her power. What's interesting about Nomi is just as the dark side inherently calls to some, the light side inherently called to her, and she was on record as being one of the most naturally gifted light side wielders in all of galactic history. So strong that we say that this would be a modern Sith Lord's nightmare. While she was able to use moderate applications of telekinesis, and was able to reflect blaster bolts with Terminus, Nomi's real powers lied in the realm of the mind. Nomi was talented in battle meditation, able to rally and meld together the minds of hundreds or even thousands of Jedi, having them all work together in unison. But when directing her battle meditation towards the enemy, she could confuse them and command them to kill one another instead. She was able to concentrate and shatter the Sith spell controlling a group of dark disciples and creatures known as the Hissis, and this wouldn't be the first time that she managed to break dark side influence. There was once a dark sorceress by the name of Alima Kido, who used Sith secrets and battle meditation to conjure massive illusions during space conflict. She used this power to either conceal Exar Kun's fleet or to make it seem much larger than it was, creating monstrous creatures of nightmares to frighten the opposing pilots and make them spin out of control. Alima pulled this off quite often to secure victories for the Sith Lord. However, when she met Nomi Sunrider in battle, Nomi could sense that this was all just a simple illusion, and used her own battle meditation to utterly crush it. But it doesn't end here. Nomi uses the Force to penetrate Alima's mind. Using the ability known as Mind Shard, it's described as fingers of bright force of energy entering Alima's mind and tearing apart her very thoughts. But as we stated earlier, Nomi Sunrider's greatest ability was Force Light, or the power of the Wall of Light. This was a powerful Jedi secret that few have been able to master. Its properties are many, and not always straightforward, but 3 specific Jedi Masters who knew of how to use it to great effect were Jedi Masters Thrawn, Arkajeth, and Odin The Wall of Light was the ability to conjure the purest form of the light side of the Force, doing so in a way that countered the dark side without fail 100% of the time. Many Jedi considered this to be the most powerful light side weapon in all of the lore. It could either contain the dark side or destroy it completely. The Jedi Arkajeth used it to purify an entire planet of Freedon Nad's power, and to trap his spirit inside of a sarcophagus. Thrawn used it to trap an entire Sith curse inside of a lake. and now Nomi would use it to freeze and trap Ulic Qel-Droma in a stasis of pure light. And later, she would combine her power with all of the other Jedi in the Order in order to form a massive wall of light and trap Exar Kun's spirit in his temple for eternity. But perhaps her most infamous feat was how she used this ability in a unique way against Ulic Qel-Droma. Ulic had once been a Jedi that Nomi fell in love with, but after he was poisoned, he turned to the dark side and became Exar Kun's apprentice. Nomi would do everything she could to defend him to the other Jedi, and tried numerous times working with Ulic's brother Kay to bring him back to the light. However, during the destruction of Ossus, Ulic would kill his brother in a fit of rage. Nomi, watching this all happen, was overcome with emotion and distress. Ulic had a moment of clarity and was left vulnerable as he cradled his brother's dead body in his arms. When this happened, Nomi, in her despair, used a Force light technique inside of Ulic's body, blinding him to his power in the Force. This would render him unable to sense or to use the Force at all. Nomi had done this in a flash of emotion, and even though she regretted doing this, she had no idea how to reverse it, since so few people knew how to use Force light. Nomi was taught how to do this by Master Odin who was now dead thanks to Exar Kun. One thing that should be mentioned though, a very common misconception is that Nomi stripped Ulic of his ability to use the Force, in the same way that Nihilus and Sion had stripped the Force from Kreia. This is not the case though. When Nomi did this, she was simply blocking his ability to use it by blinding him to the Force. And it was revealed thanks to the Redemption comics that Ulic was able to regain his connection to the Force in his last moments of life. And so you have it. These are the powers and feats of Nomi Sunrider, the woman who is alleged to be the strongest Jedi Grandmaster in history. We have absolutely no doubts that she was indeed powerful. Her raw talent in the Force, combined with her training by some of the most venerated Jedi ever, resulted in her becoming the strongest Jedi of that era by far, and the other Jedi would agree. But here's where we return to our original argument. Is she stronger than Yoda? At first glance, many would say that yes, she is. Had she been Grandmaster during the time of the Clone Wars, not only would the wars be over much sooner, but she would have been Sidious's worst nightmare. Her abilities to break Sith curses and override dark-side powers with nothing but her mind and willpower make her absolutely terrifying to any wielder of the dark side, especially the Sith. Not to mention her Wall of Light ability would be sure to send the Night Sisters of Dathomir running. But this doesn't necessarily mean that she is stronger than Yoda. It just means that she knew more than he did and had access to knowledge that he did not. This is where it gets tricky, but with Jedi knowledge is power. The more you know, the more you can manipulate. In this way, Nomi is stronger than Yoda. But when we are talking about raw power and potential, we haven't seen anything to suggest that Nomi's strength eclipses that of Yoda's. If anything, they may be even with one another, or perhaps Yoda's potential is greater. The difference between them is that Nomi simply knew more ancient Jedi secrets than Yoda could ever learn. She had been trained under both Master Thrawn, a being who is said to know more about the light side than even the might of the combined Jedi Council, and Master Odan the Jedi Archivist of the Great Library, a man who had been around for hundreds of years. Both of these Jedi Masters would give Nomi secrets that they would give to no one else, which is why she became Grand Master. With the destruction of Ossus came a tremendous loss in Jedi knowledge and light side abilities that Nomi knew and Yoda did not. Had this not happened, Yoda absolutely could have mastered these abilities. But to wrap things up, to compare and decide who is more powerful, we would have to look at them in each category, and unfortunately, there just aren't enough feats from Nomi Sunrider. What we said about Nomi being in the Clone Wars was theoretical, as she has allowed her emotions to stop her in the past and become blindsided by them. Nomi has not only lashed out in rage and blocked someone from using the Force, but would make many similar emotionally driven decisions. And we're talking about this even after she was declared the Grand Master. She never recovered from her loss of Ulic or her husband, as she kept personal holopictures of them around, taking them with her wherever she went. Despite the fact that she is incredibly gifted in the Force, she carries with her a sense of helplessness instead of strength and leadership. In this way, Yoda is the massively superior Grand Master. He may have been blinded by arrogance and dogma, but for the most part, he at least made decisions with wisdom and a clear mind. Even on matters that he disagreed with, such as Obi-Wan training Anakin, He would consider all of the angles and rule in the manner that benefited everyone. We've talked before about how Yoda was given a loaded deck in his time. At least Nomi had an enemy that she could see, Yoda did not. But nonetheless, potential to potential, Nomi Sunrider is clearly a rival of the Grand Master. But anyway, my members of the Jedi Council are often seen in the background, with Yoda and Windu often being the voices of the Council whenever they come to a decision. It can be easy to forget that there are 10 other powerful masters that sit in the circle and deliberate with them. Each of these council members are powerful and notable in their own respective ways, bringing something entirely new to the council. Although we aren't aware of their skills or prowess individually a lot of the time, we do find out the reasons why these masters sit upon the very apex of the Jedi Order, despite there being 10,000 Jedi Knights to choose from. It is always fascinating to analyze these council members' strength and see what makes them notable. In today's holocron, we are going to be discussing one of these such background characters that is more important than many give him credit for. Yarael Poof, distinguished by his long neck and often mistaken as a Camanoan. Poof is a Quamarian Jedi Master who frequently got forgotten when considering the strongest of the Council. Where some might look to Oporan Sissis as one of the finest lesser members, many are unfamiliar with the story of Yarael and how he saved the entire planet of Coruscant, as well as the galactic public before the Clone Wars ever broke out. So today, my friends, let's dive into the obscure and discuss the power, the legacy of Master Yarael Poof. But before we dive in, our mystics have sensed a great disturbance in the Force. Many of whom are watching have not yet subscribed, and we would hate for you to be left out of our daily uploads of Star Wars lore. So be sure to reach out and force crush that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so that you too may be enlightened. All jokes aside, my friends, thank you so much for the support, and let's get into this holocron. In actuality, there is not much to discuss when it comes to the beginning or the personal life of Yarael Poof. Like many other Jedi, it is assumed that he was found as an infant on Kinha and was raised at the Jedi Temple as an initiate, eventually passing the trials and ascending to the rank of Jedi Master. Likely one of the reasons we don't see him in the field much is because he chose the path of a Jedi Consular, opting to explore the deeper mysteries of the Force and resolve conflict by non-violent methods. He was a diplomat and a mystic, often making his appearances during council meetings or political gatherings. He would make his staple as one of the most politically involved Jedi Masters during the Canon High Republic era, and was often holding the ear of many powerful chancellors and senators. At the time, this was Chancellor Lina So, and Master Poof, who said to embody what it meant to be true as a Jedi, was patient and wise, as well as being extremely compassionate, one of the greatest Jedi of his time. We might even say that Master Poof was more of a polar opposite to what we would see in Ki-Adi-Mundi, whereas Mundi was very strict to the Jedi Code to a fault, growing to perhaps even be slightly cold-hearted. Master Yarael honored the Jedi Code in its very essence, protecting life and allowing it to grow. On this note, he would often put the safety of innocence over missions given by the Council to him, going out of his way to pause what he was doing if someone needed his help. As far as his personal life in the temple went, Master Poof would train the Jedi Roar and Korob to knighthood, the Ithorian Jedi who would famously make a brave final stand against Grievous during the Battle of Coruscant. When it came to the Master's strength in the Force, Master Poof gained his notoriety for being extremely talented in the realm of the mind. In fact, it was said that of anyone on the High Council, Master Yarael had the strongest mind, even more powerful than that of Yoda. And this mind power doesn't mean telekinesis, but the ability to influence someone else's mind and affect it. This is essentially the umbrella term for which the classic Jedi mind trick would stem, but Master Yarael had perfected this one ability and taken it to the highest degree possible, being able to manipulate people's minds to project powerful force illusions at very little cost of his own energy. During one excursion, the Master was searching the lower levels of Coruscant on a mission. Eventually, he would come across a young child being chased by a group of teenagers, intending to harm him. The Jedi Master would then cast an illusion of a massive rancor behind the boy, terrifying all of the gang members into turning tail and running away as fast as possible. The Jedi would explain to the boy that those who are fearful lash out at others to make themselves feel safe, and all he did was help make their fears a little more visible. Just to be clear, Master Yarael used an extremely advanced technique to reach into the minds of 5 individuals, casting an illusion that only they could see, and he did so with ease. Master Poof was talented in the gifts of psychometry, as he was able to track down a force-imbued object by following its trail all throughout the underbelly of Coruscant. In fact, he was so powerful that Windu himself was originally going to take on this mission, but it was turned over to Master Yarael for this very reason. While the Jedi Master did prefer to solve things non-violently and through the use of his mind tricks, there comes a time when all Jedi must brandish their lightsaber. And although his lightsaber was seldom used, he was no weakling with the blade. Wielding a long-handed blue greatsaber, the Jedi Master could deflect blaster fire masterfully from multiple opponents, while also simultaneously disarming, dismembering, and even beheading assassins. It's more than likely that the Jedi Master was using Form 6 9-Man, as he also mixed in force-based attacks with his saber movements, and preferred more direct and simplistic movements with his saber, which kept his options open. Despite his tall and lanky form, Yarael moved with surprising speed, able to cross a gap between himself and a blaster-wielding opponent in a single bound, dismembering the man before his finger could squeeze the trigger. The Jedi Master's feats and death would all unfortunately occur in the Legends comic run Zam Wesell, which takes place many years prior to the events of Attack of the Clones. In the comic, a radicalized Anundat general by the name of Ashar Korda had declared a personal war on the Republic and had stolen a Force artifact in order to bring about the Republic's destruction. Having hired Jango Fett to retrieve the artifact, the bounty hunter would learn from Zam that it was a Force-powered idol which contained a stored wealth of Force energy. When released, this power had the potential to cause the same destruction as a massive bomb. Korda planned on planting the idol in one of Coruscant's power cores to overload it, and cause a chain reaction which would ultimately completely annihilate the capital world, crippling the Republic there. After some coercion, Jango Fett would eventually agree to help save Coruscant. At this time, Master Yarael was given the mission by the Council to hunt down the artifact and to stop this event from occurring. Jango, Zam, and Master Yarael would all converge at the same point on Coruscant's reactor cores in order to battle the Mad General, as well as his men, to stop the event from occurring. Despite not knowing or really trusting one another, the Jedi Master and the bounty hunters worked together to stop the terrorists, with the event ending by way of the Jedi Master cutting the hand off of Korda with the attack that severed the hand that we mentioned earlier. The Jedi then began to use the Force to pull the idol out of the reactor, but while he was focusing, Korda stabbed him in the stomach with a knife. Jango executed the general with a volley of blaster shots, while Zam saved the overloaded idol from falling into the reactor's abyss. With his final breath, Yarael Poof would use the last of his strength to recontain the energy of the idol, not allowing it to explode, and would eventually pass on through the Force. Jango and Zam would be the only ones to witness the death of this great Jedi Master, and would eventually go to return the idol where it belonged, honoring him. Although the Council would have no idea who helped him, they all acknowledged that he saved trillions of lives that day, as well as the Republic itself with his bravery, and he was given a traditional Jedi funeral. He would be succeeded on the Jedi High Council by the much less accomplished Coleman Trebor by the time of the Clone Wars' very beginning, as he assumed Yarael Poof's seat. And this, my friends, was the power. Told you that in all of Star Wars lore, there is only a single Camanoan Jedi. One Jedi that lived for nearly 3,000 years and was the only Force sensitive of her entire species, with this making her a massive threat to the Camanoan people, as she ultimately chose exile over joining with them. Well, today, we will explain the story of the only Camanoan Jedi that we know of in Star Wars lore, why she was so unique and powerful, how she lived so long, and why she ultimately resolved to leave her people. The Jedi Master that we will be focusing on today is known as Kinha. Your prowess with a lightsaber is childish vanity. Your physical Force powers are no more than a conjurer's trick, sleight of hand to dazzle the ordinary beings you should be serving. You profane these powers by using them as weapons in war, and you fail to grasp the single, simple, uncompromising duty of a true Jedi. The Jedi is the rock lion at the gate who says, "I will defend these beings with my life, and that is the sum of me." Kinha was a female Camanoan Jedi Master trained during the Era of Peace known only as the Republic Classic Era. Born on Kamino, Kinha was a Camanoan who had been genetically altered to survive long hyperspace journeys. These deep space missions were never carried out, and Ha was left without purpose among her highly organized homeworld and people, making her somewhat of an outcast. Matters grew worse as she entered her adulthood. Her force sensitivity began to manifest itself, drawing the criticism and disdain of her perfectionist peers, with her peers whispering behind her back that she had no place among them, perceived by them as an outcast, as she not only was force sensitive, but also did not act like a typical Kaminoan. She had a sense of morals beyond her people, and was not always focused on being perfect. Not to mention she also had a sense of humor, something that was incredibly rare for the Kaminoan people, as they believed that because she had been genetically altered to survive so long in hyperspace, that there was something wrong with her and Kinha had essentially gone rotten. Because of this, Kinha eventually departed her homeworld for fear of being re-educated, losing all of her memories, or potentially even killed by her own people. During her journeys, Ha came under the tutelage of the rogue Jedi known as Krashaduk, who trained her as a Jedi Guardian. Over many years of training unofficially by the Jedi, Kinha was deemed a Jedi Knight. What made her exceptionally rare is of course she was much older than is commonplace to be trained by a Jedi, but because she came across a rogue Jedi Master and he sensed her latent force potential, he resolved to train her anyway. With the Kaminoan people rejecting her, her Jedi Master believed that she was a clean slate and could still be trained as a successful Jedi, with her Jedi Master not wanting the force potential manifesting in a Kaminoan to go to waste, believing this to be a sign of the force that she was worthy of training. Eventually, Kinha was officially inducted into the Jedi Order as a Jedi Master, with many on the council at the time believing that she was a valiant and faithful Jedi, not being as weary as they would be during the Clone Wars era. For nearly 3,000 years, Kinha served faithfully as a Jedi Master of the Order. This is perplexing as she was far older than even the current Grandmaster and Jedi Grandmaster Yoda. However, Kinha never wanted to take a place on the Jedi Council, believing that she wanted to protect the innocence of the galaxy in a more active role, and began to perceive many of the flaws in the Jedi Order as the Clone Wars era began. She saw that the Jedi were becoming far more dogmatic, and considered herself lucky to be trained in an era where this was not the case. Again, Kinha was trained generations before even Grandmaster Yoda was born, and therefore essentially represented the last of the ancient Jedi. This was also reflected in her lightsaber, which was made nearly entirely of the gold alloy known as Electra. Her armor was also indicative of the ancient Jedi, as she still actually, well, wore armor. Kinha was even around to see Revan in the Mandalorian Wars, growing a strong bond with the Mandalorians in the process. It was even recorded that following the Mandalorian Wars, Kinha traveled the galaxy as a roamer and a nomad, helping any of those that required her aid, and saving many worlds without the greater knowledge of the Jedi Order or the Jedi Council, nor their permission. After nearly 100 years, Kinha settled on the planet known as Verusku. It was here where she was plagued with a terrifying vision from the dark side itself, as she saw soldiers from her homeworld of Kamino infected and embracing the dark side, purging the galaxy of all Jedi. What Kinha was granted with was a vision of the clone troopers and the Clone Wars. In a very rare occurrence, Kinha ventured back to the Jedi Temple in an effort to warn the Council. However, it was far too late. When the Clone Wars eventually broke out, Kinha refused to have any part in them, believing that her vision had to take place for the galaxy to continue, and that her pleas for the Jedi not to adopt the clones would only fall on deaf ears, learning that perhaps the Jedi Order needed to be rebuilt. However, when they did fall, Kinha would arrive to help the stragglers and the survivors of the Great Purge that she knew would soon come. Eventually, when Order 66 was enacted and the Jedi were gunned down by the clone troopers that Kinha had feared so vehemently, she leaped into action, attempting to save as many young Jedi Padawans as possible. And after rescuing a group from the clone troopers, as she herself obviously was not a part of the Clone War and was not around them, she ventured to an old Mandalorian friend who promised that they they would smuggle the young Jedi Padawans as well as Kinha to safety. Their Mandalorian protector promised them that they would find a secret Jedi refuge where more Jedi were hiding out, with Kinha hoping that the Great Jedi Purge would not last too long and that she would have the power necessary to protect the young Padawans. Unfortunately for us, the tale of Kinha ends here, and we have no idea what happened to the famed 3,000-year-old Jedi Master. In my mind, however, there are two options for Kinha's outcome. Perhaps she took the Jedi Padawans into safety during the Purge, hiding where the Clone Wars had not managed to find her, and again, escaped from the reign of the Great Galactic Empire, the wrath of Lord Vader and Lord Sidious. Perhaps because she was 3,000 years old, she was able to hide away the Jedi younglings to a place where the Empire never discovered them, where they could live out their days in peace. And the second, far more grim option is that either the clones, Darth Vader, or the Inquisitors located Kinha and executed her on the spot. I would like to think of the latter, however. The idea that potentially Kinha trained a new generation of Force wielders, training them in the old days of the Jedi Order as protectors, and as she stated, the stone lions at the gate, venturing the galaxy as nomads and as a sort of pure knight, with no allegiance to the Republic or a wider order. But anyway, the noble Wookiee race is constant in just about any part of the galaxy that you might visit, from pilots and mechanics to smugglers and even bounty hunters. Yet a very small number of them have ever become Jedi. This is of course of the naturally low force sensitivity rates in their species. Whenever a Wookiee does end up becoming a Jedi though, it's always fascinating to behold. It seems almost oxymoronic that a species known for their temper would be able to learn the peaceful and passive nature of the Jedi. However, several Wookiees have successfully walked this path and become powerful members of the Order. But ironically, what we don't ever see are dark side Wookiees or Wookiee Sith. Actually, there haven't been any Wookiees who have turned to the dark side ever in recorded lore. This curious phenomenon has vexed the researchers in these archives, as we once analyzed each Wookiee Jedi that we knew of to see the common traits that they had. However, in this holocron, we wanted to really dig into the true reason why no Force sensitives of this apparently rage-filled species have ever succumbed to the lure of the dark side, and what makes them so incredibly powerful as Jedi Knights and servants of the light. Why is it that the dark side avoids the Wookiees? Or why could it be that a Wookiee's will is so ironclad that the temptations of the dark are meaningless to them? The first thing that we have to look at with Wookiees are their cultural standards. While we know that Wookiee Jedi are usually taken at childhood, they have the values of their people baked into their very DNA, especially when they read up on their own people in the archives and take pride in their origins. The Wookiee race is intrinsically connected to their planet of Kashyyyk and religiously worship the Worship trees. As we saw with Gungi's tribe in the Bad Batch, there are Wookiee mystics who claim to be able to hear the trees speak and know of their will. Gungi himself was able to confirm this by sensing the tree through the Force. This is because Kashyyyk is very rich in the Force due to all of the natural flora and fauna. The Wookiees have a very deep-rooted respect for life and nature, all things that make up and respect the light side of the Force. It may be as simple as saying that the Wookiees are more inclined towards the light, much like the Kaldor or the Ithorians, but we believe it runs even deeper than this. Their respect towards the sanctity of the living is shown in their now famous holiday, Life Day, which celebrates the tenets of family, joy, and harmony. Life Day became so popular that, although it originated on Kashyyyk, the rest of the galaxy adopted it as a holiday as well, with Coruscant even going all out with parades and decorations. The point being, Wookiees may be known for their temperamental nature, but they are more known for their respect and their love of life, loyalty, and bravery. You may have often heard the Aka suffix in many Wookiees' names. Chewbacca, Lobaka, and Tyvaka all share this word in common with their name. The Shiri Wook is directly translated as a title meaning the brave. The values of courage and willingness to protect one's home and family was everything to Wookiee culture. The idea that one would ever choose to act selfishly would be affront to all of these tenets. We have to remember that the Wookiees are very proud people. But it's not the type of pride that would lead to arrogance as some people understand pride. Rather, the pride the Wookiees have are towards their core values and their honor, which all reside in the tenets. But of course, with enough torture, the Sith have proven before that they can just get about anyone they want to eventually turn to the dark side. But still, the Wookiees never have. Some phenomenally powerful and loyal Jedi such as Bastila Shan and Anakin Skywalker would embrace the dark. Luke Skywalker had a deep pull to it despite being rooted in the light the majority of his life, and even once turned to the dark side after being influenced by the Emperor. And yet, no Wookiee ever has. This brings us into another important aspect of Wookiee culture. Despite how proud and strong they are, they're one of the most oppressed species in the entire galaxy. People look down on them as wild, smelly animals rather than actual people, and none exemplifies this tragedy more than their relationship with the Trandoshans. The rivalry between the Wookiees and Trandoshans is now legendary, and we spent quite a few episodes of the Clone Wars exploring the Trandoshan slavers' attack on the Wookiees, and then again in the Bad Batch when the Trandoshans had decided to lend their aid to the Empire for the same reason. This all speaks to the hunter culture of the Trandoshans, not just culturally, but religiously in fact. They believed in a deity that they referred to as the Scorekeeper, a ruthless and difficult to please woman who, according to their legend, kept log of all the points gained by the Trandoshan hunters. For their people, getting points through the hunt was everything, and in their religion, Wookiee pelts were worth a lot of points. This resulted in a mass hunt for Wookiees, which had sparked their eternal rivalry. The Wookiee people know what it's like to be oppressed and killed for no good reason, so they could never justify doing that to anyone else like the Sith do. Miraculously, their oppression has made them a stronger people group. What this does not mean though, is that training a Wookiee as a Jedi being easy. In fact, it can be exceptionally difficult. We believe that the Jedi take an active role in treating these Wookiees special among other Jedi trainees, being very careful with them thanks to their very strong nature, and I believe that they take special precautions to ensure that they will not turn. As if a Wookiee Jedi ever did turn to the dark side, I believe they would be supremely powerful, with the dark side trying everything that it can to finally take a hold of this beautiful species. Due to their temperament, there is more of a focus on learning patience and the control of one's anger. This doesn't mean that their temper will be completely baked out of them, as even Master Tyvaka was a little testy sometimes, and was known for losing his cool. Yet, the Jedi seem to really play towards the Wookiees' love for life and bravery to encourage their use of the Force for peace and balance. Tyvaka turned out to be one of the most loyal and insightful Jedi the Order had ever seen, earning him a place on the High Council. Gungan was very loving as a young trainee, who went out of his way to help people whenever he could, even if he didn't always have the means to. Lobaka, although he enjoyed battle, had a great sense of humor and was always hanging around with his close friends. He was heartbroken when Jacen Solo embraced the dark side, as he considered him his closest friend. All of this said, the Wookiees were not perfect Jedi, and we believe that several Wookiee Jedi have been tempted by the dark side. The main Wookiee Jedi that we'll be talking about is a youngling by the name of Krishish, and had an extremely close friendship with a young Trandoshan Jedi by the name of Gyre. The two of them and their third friend were all very close and trained under Grandmaster Yoda in lightsaber instruction. They would all become enamored with lightsaber combat following watching Yoda and Dooku give a demonstration. However, one night, Krishish was meditating and he saw a terrifying vision of the Trandoshans killing his people on Kashyyyk. With the vision ended up showing him his friend in Gyre attacking him with his lightsaber and murdering him. Deeply distressed by what he had seen, he would eventually run into Jedi Master Dooku. Dooku, trying to be helpful, gave him advice that would seem appropriate, saying that the council brushed off visions and did not treat them with any seriousness whatsoever. He then encouraged the young Wookiee to keep a close eye on things and act upon his vision if necessary, as the Force could be giving him a warning. Dooku also told the young Wookiee to not tell Yoda about his vision, as the Grand Master would brush it off. This caused the young Wookiee Jedi to completely cut himself off from his friends, including his closest one in Gyre. Soon, Yoda would take note of this and have a long talk with the young Wookiee, who revealed his vision and confessed his fear. Yoda would give him a talk about respect towards his fellow Jedi, and that the rivalry between the Trandoshans and the Wookiees had no place in the walls of the temple. In the end, the young Wookiee and the Trandoshan became great friends once more. at least for a few more years. When the two grew older than Padawans, the nightmares about Gare would return. Only this time, the young Wookiee had nightmares about Gare embracing the dark side, attacking the Wookiee, and murdering him. After another misunderstood conversation with Dooku, the Wookiee would get the idea that he needed to prevent this vision by any means necessary. While the entire group was out on a field trip on another planet, the Wookiee would lead Gare out into a secluded place where he would suddenly attack her. The two would have a brief duel when the Trandoshan did everything she could to talk him down, telling her friend that she had no intentions of ever hurting anyone, and that in fact, he was the one that was hurting people. At this point, the young Wookiee was so deep in fear and anger that he was completely unreachable. Even after their third friend attempted to intervene in the Wookiee's rampage, he ended up hurting their friend by grazing his arm with the lightsaber, and soon Gare would best Kashyyyk in the duel, disarming him. This, however, would not work, and the Wookiee gave in to his fear one more time, lurching towards his friend and choking her, attempting to kill her until Yoda himself intervened. That's when Kashyyyk revealed his vision again, but Yoda attempted to assure him that they had no idea if the vision was true, saying that there was no reason to believe that Gare would ever turn to the dark side. Yoda also pointed out that these things hadn't happened and that the Wookiee was protecting no one, not even the Force, by attacking his friend. Yoda showed the Wookiee that he gave in to his fear and allowed his fear to drive his actions, coming very close to the dark side. The Wookiee was deeply ashamed of himself and returned to the temple for more training, attempting to fortify his feelings in the light yet again. Unfortunately, Gare was so deeply disturbed by his vision and her turning to the dark side that she was worried that if she continued down the path of a Jedi, that the vision would come true, and she ultimately decided to depart the Jedi Order. Yoda would later consider this to be one of the greatest failures of his entire life. Only later did he find out that Dooku had encouraged the young Wookiee to act upon his vision. This would be the only time that we know of when a Force-sensitive Wookiee came into contact with the dark side, even if to some it appeared justifiable. The young Wookiee would eventually make good on his promise to never embrace the dark side again though, but this of course begs the question, is it possible for a Wookiee, Force-sensitive or not, to be bad? The cases are extremely rare, but it is possible. Like all beings in the galaxy, no one is exempt from choosing to be a good or a bad person. A great example of a Wookiee gone rotten is Black Chrysanthemum. He was disgraced from Kashyyyk and banished from his homeworld for yet unknown reasons. But just by looking at his personality, you can probably guess why. He enjoyed hurting others and liked to hear them scream when he attacked them. He became a bounty hunter just to satiate his bloodlust and to get by in the galaxy. He also had a love of money, something that no honorable Wookiee would look upon with toleration at all. Besides him, there was also a Wookiee bounty hunter who worked for the Sith Empire during the Great Galactic War. But of course, lucky for us, none of them were Force sensitive. So even though they had gone rotten, they were not touched by the dark side yet. But with that all said, it is definitely possible, and a Wookiee with the power of the Force that had embraced the dark side would absolutely be tremendously powerful. Being disgraced by the Jedi, being disgraced by their own people, it is possible for a Wookiee Sith to one day exist. But of course, while it is always possible that Wookiees, like any being, could embrace the dark side, the likelihood is significantly reduced primarily because of the traits of loyalty, love, and honor that they share. Like Kashyyyk, if his loyalty is ever breached, they become depressed and ashamed of what they have done. This shame keeps them from being able to continue to commit violent acts. Simply put, the Wookiees may be quick to anger and jumping to conclusions, but they are a morality-driven race that is hardwired to love others. And it is this love that keeps them from turning to the dark side. But anyway, my friends, the only Jedi Gungan to exist, and what happened to them after they mysteriously disappeared? Greetings again, my friends, and welcome back to the archives. The Jedi Order is known for having members of all species make up their ranks. The Jedi usually don't discriminate what species they're willing to recruit from, as they accept Force sensitives from almost all corners of the galaxy, so long as they are young enough to be inducted. However, there are a select few races that we don't often see in the ranks of the Jedi, one of them being the noble Wookiee race, with only a handful of known members in all of the Order's history. However, even rarer than that would be the plucky Gungan race of Naboo. At almost no point in the Jedi Order's history do we see a Gungan in the Jedi Order. However, there are actually two of them active around the period just prior to the Clone Wars. Their names were the Jedi Knight Kinha Dosen and the Jedi Padawan Kosa Yin Hadu. So what became of the only known Jedi Gungans, and why did one of them turn to the dark side and choose to serve the Sith? Well, today, my friends, let's open up a holocron and explore the history of the rare Jedi Gungans. Kinha Dosen and his Padawan Kosa Yin Hadu trained their entire lives in the Jedi Order as any other Jedi would. They lived during the Republic Classic era, but neither of them would ever see the Clone Wars. In fact, they actually wouldn't even be present for the blockade of Naboo or see their people make peace with the surface of Naboo. The two of them would have been dispatched on a mission in the year 33 BBY, exactly 1 year before the events of the Phantom Menace. But this mission was shrouded in deep mystery. No information exists within the Jedi Order's archives on where the two were dispatched or what they were trying to accomplish. In fact, many years later, the Jedi Master Sin Lukur would devote a great deal of time to uncovering the secret of the Gungan Jedi's final mission. However, all of her efforts turned up absolutely nothing. This is alarming because their leaving on this mission was the last time the two Gungan Jedi were ever seen, as they subsequently vanished from Coruscant. The fate of the Jedi Knight Kinha Dosen is unknown. However, we have sneaking suspicions of what may have happened to him due to the turnout of his young Padawan. Kosa Yin would eventually fall to the dark side, and 2 years later, he was found on the ancient Sith world of Almas. We believe that one of two things happened. Either Kosa turned to the dark side and murdered his master, or Kinha's ultimate death was what drove Kosa Yin into darkness in the first place. Either way, the single remaining Gungan in all of the lore was now a member of the Believers. The Believers were a Sith-worshipping cult that lived inside of an ancient Sith temple on Almas. This world was once home to the Dark Lord known as Riven. This is Riven with an I, not to be confused with Darth Revan. Darth Riven was a Sith scientist and a sorcerer, one who perfected many esoteric techniques never before seen by the galaxy. One of his most powerful achievements was the very fortress itself that the Believers were hiding in. Along with this, Riven had actually done a good thing by populating the once uninhabitable world of Almas, regrowing vegetation called the Kaluthan plant. In doing this, the world became hospitable again, and over the course of thousands of years, settlers now inhabit the world peacefully, cultivating this sacred plant as a new way of life. But along with this, Jedi had also settled on the world and used it as an outpost. This caused the Sith cult to become terrified that the Jedi would soon learn of their whereabouts. Because of this, the leaders of the Sith cult tasked the now dark Jedi Gungan with poisoning the plants. All of this was in service to a complicated plot to force the Jedi off of the world by turning the farmers against them. The cult didn't yet want to reveal their existence, which is why they didn't just attack the Jedi outright. The plan was to sow animosity between the farmers and the Jedi. Along with using his knowledge to poison the vegetation, Hadu would also go undercover and badmouth the Jedi in public locations within earshot of the farmers, attempting to tell them that the Jedi were responsible for the problems that they were facing with the plants. Hadu would also make sure to intercept a shipment of much-needed supplies for the Jedi scientists, who were trying to uncover the real reason behind why the plants were dying. It would be on this exact mission that Kosa Yin Hadu would make his presence known to the wider galaxy. He had traveled to the world of Kularin with another Dark Jedi at the time and some battle droids in order to intercept the shipment of scientific supplies. But during this mission, a group of skilled individuals who were known as the Heroes of Kularin saw Hadu harassing the captain of the shipment, and the group would now intercept the Dark Jedi Gungan. The Dark Jedi, though, would make a quick escape, still not trying to have his position compromised. It was too late, though, and the heroes traveled to Almas to see what this was all about. They then helped the scientists uncover the secrets of the poisoning of all of the plants, and while fending off the Dark Jedi's repeated attempts to indirectly obstruct their path, finally, the group would locate the Sith cult. They would then launch a surprise attack on the cult's camp, surprising the Dark Jedi Gungan. The leader of the cult and several other members would flee on speeders, and would abandon the Dark Jedi Gungan to duel the group himself. He would put up a decent fight, showing off a lot of knowledge in the dark side, using powers and abilities that are rare that we'll be discussing in a moment. But in the end, the heroes bested him and slew the Dark Jedi in battle. This was the end of Hadu, the only Gungan in Jedi history to turn to the dark side, and one of only 2 Gungan Jedi in all of the lore. We would have loved to know more about exactly what had killed his master before this, and what drove Hadu to the dark side. It's also a shame that Hadu was seen to be little more than a lackey to the Sith cult, despite having a very sure knowledge of the dark side and of the Jedi Order that he stemmed from. The first thing to mention about this Gungan Jedi though was his lightsaber, and how he had successfully imbued his crystal with so much power that the crystal itself became a dark side talisman. Anyone who wielded his lightsaber would be flooded with dark side energy, drastically improving their connection to the dark side, and increasing their ability to use the Force in destructive ways. Hadu only used basic applications of the Force outside of himself, but his true talents lied in his ability to harness the Force internally. The Gungan was a master of Force Valor and Force Rage, having multiple facets of these abilities. He was also able to not only increase his speed and quick bursts of movement, but he could increase his physical strength within an instant, bringing down crippling strikes with his saber to off-balance his opponents and break their defenses. He was even shown to shrug off direct hits from blaster bolts, but with this came a flaw. He used Force Rage too frequently, which interrupted his ability to concentrate. When the heroes faced off against Hadu at his full power, the fight was a struggle to take him down, and it required their combined might to bring an end to the unexpectedly powerful Gungan Dark Jedi. Despite being lost by the Order as a Jedi Padawan, his skills in the dark side had had him grow in power astronomically. But this story naturally leads us to the question, why were there no more Gungan Jedi than these 2 that we have found in the lore? And why were there never any Sith Gungan Jedi either? When it comes to the Jedi, there could be a couple reasons, the most plain of which being that it's possible that Gungans have a low rate of Force sensitivity. This is usually the accepted answer for why certain races aren't seen in the Jedi Order. Another reason is likely because of how much the Gungan people value keeping their own. We have to remember that the Gungans are a very secluded race, and only started interacting with the outside galaxy and their own surface neighbors by around the events of the Phantom Menace, and were in hiding prior. We also believe the Jedi did not select Gungans because of how innately familial they were. They care a lot about each other in their home, and despite being reclusive, it's in service to protecting their people and their community. That is why banishing a Gungan is one of the worst forms of punishment possible. This innately bred the ability to form attachments, which is why the Jedi likely didn't bother much with the Gungan race. And it is because of these attachments that we believe that the Gungan Hadu turned to the dark side, likely due to his master's death and the deep attachment that he had formed with him. Hadu proved that the Gungan could have a bad day, and that was enough to turn him to the dark side. But with that, why didn't the Sith ever recruit from these people? Simply put, the Sith looked down on the Gungan race, and already were very elitist in their thinking. They don't just want the most powerful, but they want prestige as well. This is of course incorrect, and the Gungans were powerful warriors, but Sith culture is highly dependent on status as well as notoriety. We also know though that the Gungan people are innately compassionate and loyal. A Gungan's loyalty is hard to buy, but invaluable once you get it. Much like the Wookiees, they have a religiously driven life debt system, and this sort of loyalty is less than worthless to the Sith, and in fact is a hindrance. Gungans will not betray anyone they see as a friend unless they've done something irredeemable, and that is why we believe that the Gungan race were not recruited by the Jedi or the Sith. But anyway, my friend, the famous Jedi prophecy of the Chosen One, the Sith actually had one of their own. So, who exactly was the Chosen One of the Sith? Who was the fabled Sith Ari? And did anybody fulfill the prophecy of the Chosen One of the Sith Empire? While the Jedi had a prophecy of balance, what did the Sith believe would ultimately happen when their Chosen One arose in the galaxy? The prophecy of the Chosen One is the most famous in all of the Jedi lore, but as we all know, it wasn't the only Chosen One prophecy to exist within the Force. The Sith had their own prophecy dating back to the ancient days of the galaxy, contemporary with, and likely even predating the Jedi's Chosen One prophecy. The Sith of old spoke of a being that would be without limits, one which would both destroy and lead the Sith Order to greatness. They were known as the Sith Ari. We've spoken before about the Sith Ari within these archives by simply giving it some explanation and speculation. However, in today's video, we have decided to undertake the task of confirming once and for all who fulfilled the prophecy of the Sith Chosen One. Who was the Sith Ari? Like all prophecies though, nothing is ever straightforward, and everything is up to conjecture of course. But we believe that by analyzing the most likely candidates and comparing their actions with each line of the Sith Ari's prophecy, we aim to nail down who truly was the Chosen One of the Sith. Who was the Dark Mirror to Anakin Skywalker? Before I begin though, if you've been enjoying our deep dive into all Star Wars lore, reach out with the Force and crush that subscribe button if you haven't yet. It is your destiny. We have foreseen it. Now acolytes, let us begin. To examine the origins of the Sith Ari, we must travel back to the year 28,000 BBY, 3,000 years before the formation of the Galactic Republic. In this day, the Sith world of Korriban was still primitive and tribalistic, constantly at war due to their nature in the dark side, a savage species, one who had not yet learned to control their innate power. This would all change though, with the coming of a great warrior, one who would rise above his red brethren, a member of the species by the name of Adis. In the deep lore, King Adis is described as impossibly large and incredibly powerful in combat. Adis wielded two force-imbued axes which were so heavy that only the strongest of the Massassi, the Sith, were able to wield even one of them. By proving himself in battle and rising above the rest of his kin through bloodshed alone, Adis would be named king over all the pure-blooded Sith people with one roar, a rally of all of them beneath his single banner, ceasing their infighting, uniting for the first time in the history of the Sith under the House of the Axe. The reign of the Axe of King Adis would last 300 years as the Dark Lord kept himself alive through the dark side itself. The Sith people all worshipped Adis as a god, but he was not a god, he was simply a king. But with the rule of King Adis is the first known writing of the Sith Ari in its very origins. King Adis was the original founder of the title, a title given to him by the Kasai priests, the Sith at the time who had their ear most attuned to the whispers of the dark side. When the ancient conquerors, the Rakata, came to Korriban and attempted to overthrow Adis and his grand empire, they were eventually driven back by the primitive Sith people, led alone by the powerful axe of King Adis. Adis, who fought them off so brutally that he single-handedly forced them to retreat his world, proving that perhaps he was more than a king. Adis would decimate wave after wave of Rakata before eventually succumbing to his injuries, giving his life for the betterment of his own people. The prophecy of the Sith Ari would begin here, with their supposedly being foretold the second coming of their god king, one who would take upon them the title and rule their people yet again. According to the Sith Lady Sorza Sin, a powerful sorcerer, the title roughly translates to Overlord, and the many Kasai priests believed that the prophecy began and ended with King Adis. However, other Sith purebloods held hope, and the prophecy was eventually passed down through the generations. Importantly though, the prophecy was never written, as the Kasai priests considered it to be too sacred to be placed on paper. With this though, we found some issues and conflicting versions of the Sith Ari prophecy. However, the essence of the Sith Ari prophecy is three very strange lines. These lines are as follows. The Sith Ari will be free of limits. The Sith Ari will lead the Sith and destroy them. The Sith Ari will raise the Sith from death and make them stronger than before. The prophecy of the Sith Ari was so important to the purebloods that even Ajunta Pao, the first ever true Dark Lord of the Sith, who killed the Sith pure-blooded king and set himself up as the new god of the world, would refuse to claim the title. Ajunta saw how fiercely superstitious the Sith people were about the Sith Ari specifically, so the Dark Jedi wisely chose to leave the title alone and buried, fearing violent repercussions. Over the years, the Sith Ari's prophecy would fade into legend, and it was never really taken seriously from that point on. Ironically, most Sith Lords thought the prophecy was hogwash and superstition made by a primitive people, Oftentimes, the Sith don't believe in any prophecies due to their tendency to seize power for themselves. They do not subscribe themselves to the wish and the will of fate. Despite this though, there would certainly be a great many Sith who would speculate themselves to be this fabled Sith Ari. Even Darth Plagueis would have an interest in taking on the prophecy, as he stated this in his novel. Prophecies are generally wishful thinking. The fact that the Sith created their own savior myth is predictable, but the prophecy states that a being will arise who is free from restrictions, and who will destroy the Sith Order only to make them stronger than before. These statements seem uniquely specific to the actions I am taking now. I am not a creature of superstition, but if the robes of the Sith Ari fit, I see no reason not to claim the title. Plagueis convinced himself through his study of the midichlorians that he had achieved ultimate power, and that he was the Sith Chosen One. Sidious, though, would violently later refute this, stating that Plagueis was indeed limited by his own blindness and arrogance. But with all of that said, we believe that there could still be 4 candidates who stand strong for the title of the Sith Ari and the Chosen One of the dark side. The widely accepted individuals are Revan, Valkorion, Vader, Sidious, or Bane, but we believe that we can dwindle the list down further. We don't believe that Revan was the Sith Ari. Revan held insane power in the Force, and had experience both in the light and the dark, which of course could perhaps mean he was free of limits, and this could pertain to the prophecy. But while Revan led and destroyed the Sith for a time, it was only a small facet of the real Sith Order. Revan never truly destroyed the Sith, and while he may have had a hand in remaking them, he himself never personally did. Valkorion is up next, a man who nearly became a god, and of course did his fair share of destroying his Sith brethren, and he of course would eventually make them into something stronger, the reconstituted Sith Empire. However, Valkorion never really cared for the Sith at all, and abandoned their ideals completely. Valkorion instead chose to go off and start his own empire away and separate from the Sith. Not to mention, the prophecy states that the Sith Ari will make the Sith stronger than before, and Vitiate's Sith Empire wasn't strong enough to truly overcome their enemies. But the next on the list we want to discuss is Vader, which may be a controversial decision. Vader would destroy the Sith, true, but Vader was not free of limits. In fact, he was defined by them. There have been theories that the Sith Chosen One and the Jedi Chosen One existed as the same individual. However, the actions of Anakin and Lord Vader do not line up. We cannot ignore that Anakin and Vader did not remake the Sith Order or raise them from the dead. Even if Anakin had not been burned on Mustafar, he never would have remade the Sith at all, as he did not care for them, planning to cast it aside as soon as he killed Sidious. Anakin wanted ultimate power for his family, and there is a possibility that the Skywalker family lineage could have been the new-founded Sith Order foretold by this prophecy. But again, Dark Lord Anakin was ready to squash the Sith once and for all once he got what he wanted from Sidious, and Vader cannot be the Sith Ari at any angle you look at it, although of course he still stands as the Jedi Chosen One. And now we have the final 2, Sidious and Bane. Many of the Sith themselves have pointed to Bane as the second coming of the Sith Ari, including Plagueis and his own master in Tenebris, destroying and then remaking the Sith in the Rule of Two. Even the Bane trilogy of novels heavily implies that it was Bane that was the Sith Ari, and the true return of King Adus. But Sidious still seems to be a strong candidate, except for a single line. A single line where Darth Sidious falls short. It is true, Sidious brought the Sith Order to unprecedented power, making them stronger than ever before, ruling the galaxy as its emperor, but he never destroyed the Sith. The lines of the prophecy specifically say that the Sith Ari will destroy the Sith and raise them from the dead. This is something that Sidious never did, but this is something that Lord Bane did. Interestingly, in the lore, Sidious would refute this, believing he was the Chosen One, and Sidious would cite the line that Darth Bane was not free of limits as the Sith Ari was foretold to be. Sidious still believed he was the chosen one because he was far closer to ultimate power than Bane ever was. But the prophecy does not speak of power, it speaks of limits. It never states what parameters of limits this is referring to. Most believe that this could only mean power in the Force, but if that's the case, then no Sith has ever truly fulfilled this prophecy. I believe now that the line of being without restriction can also mean the restriction of doctrine of what came before. Bane freed himself from the limits set in place by the Sith before him. He reclaimed the ancient title of Darth. He welcomed conquest. He welcomed challenge. Bane freed himself from their limits, their doctrine of equality, and did not believe in the limits of knowledge that the contemporary Sith Lords did. Bane would be truly free of limits from his time, as he was not only more powerful than any Sith alive, but he was truly a free man from their indoctrination. This is something that the Sith deeply feared. Bane would lead the Sith briefly against the Jedi for a time, before utterly destroying them, tricking Lord Khan into detonating the thought bomb. And then, Lord Bane would raise them from the dead, make them stronger than ever, setting in motion the Rule of Two, established to have the Sith Order grow and evolve for centuries. Sidious may have been the fulfillment of the Rule of Two, but he was not the chosen one. The Sith Ari, my acolytes. The title of the Sith Ari belongs to Lord Adis and Lord Bane. But with this, we have another theory that could at least bring some thought into the Sith Ari. Perhaps the Chosen One prophecy of the Sith is completely opposite to the Jedi because it is cyclical. What we mean is that Adis already existed and was the first chosen Sith, but there was never a Chosen One before Anakin. Perhaps there was a Sith Ari for every generation of Sith that needed one. Perhaps Revan, Valkorion, Bane, Sidious, and others were the Sith Ari for a time. A title that brings so much conflict because multiple Sith can wear the title if they claim it with their own actions. We must remember the core difference between the Jedi and the Sith. The Jedi wait on the Force, but the Sith take it. It would only make sense that the Chosen One is given by the Force, whereas the Sith Ari must be forcefully taken by the Sith. The way of the dark side is domination, and being the strongest to rule over the weak. King Adis didn't become the Sith Ari because he was born into it. He rose to power and commanded his rule through his strength. The same can be said for Valkorion, Bane, and Sidious. There is the possibility that the Sith Ari could be anyone strong enough to claim it for their own. And maybe this is the true meaning behind the line about having no limits. Paradoxically speaking, the true Sith Ari shouldn't be limited even by the lines of their own prophecies. But anyway, my friends, who were the very first warriors to ever wield the lightsaber? Greetings, acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. The lightsaber has always been known as a Jedi weapon. But what if I were to tell you that they were not the ones who invented it? Back in the days before the Galactic Republic was ever formed, there was the Infinite Empire, a vile system ran by the Rakatan species. The Rakata were some of the first darkside wielders to make a problem of themselves in the galaxy, but it was not they who were the first wielders of the lightsaber, but rather their slaves and servants. These wielders of the Force were known as the Force Hounds. Some time ago we talked about how the very first lightsabers were considered to be a slave weapon. Well, in today's video, we are going to be talking all about those slaves, the Force Hounds, and why they were a major threat to the ancient Jedi. But before we begin, we must inform you of an imbalance we have sensed in the Force. Some of you who are watching have not yet subscribed, so if you want to be notified when we post our daily holocrons, be sure to force crush that subscribe button and become an acolyte today. The Force Hounds play a major part of the growth of the Infinite Empire. The job of a Force Hound was to literally sniff out planets that were rich in the Force, hence their name. Using their senses, they would meditate, finding worlds for their masters to conquer. All of the technology used by the Infinite Empire was literally powered by the dark side. This included the archaic versions of hyperdrives, and they were only ever able to jump to locations that were significantly strong in the Force. By conquering these worlds and planets neighboring them, the Rakata Empire grew, and their massive collection of slaves grew as well. It would be the most gifted and strong of these slaves that they would breed the Force Hounds, and the cycle would continue. Force Hounds were integral to the growth of the Empire, but also to the status of their leaders. To own a Force Hound was extremely prestigious among the Infinite Empire. Rakata that were very powerful would rise up through the ranks, attaining the title of a Predor. It was only the Predors who actually owned Force Hounds. The way Rakatan culture worked, is the Predors were always in competition with one another, and always looking for a way to stab the other in the back and gain more power and prestige. However, their laws prevented one Predor from killing another directly, so they had to do all of their fighting and conflict through way of their Force Hounds. In this way, the Hound serves not only as scouts, but also the protectors and enforcers of the high-ranking Rakata. According to tradition, it was a Force Hound that found a rich world, and by law, the planet belonged to the owner of that Force Hound. The ruthless competition of the Rakata leaked down to the culture of the Force Hounds as well. None of them had real names, but were each just given a designation by a calling number, a letter of the Abresh alphabet. Along with this, they had their letter tattooed somewhere upon their face that was plainly visible to all. The reason was to remind the Hounds that they were always replaceable and slaves, and they either proved to be valuable to their leaders or die. According to Kesh, the marks were also tattooed on their bodies and limbs, doing so that their pieces were easily identifiable in battle. This law of survival was how the Hounds grew up with the Rakatan care. They were grouped together as children and constantly forced to fight for the entertainment of the overlords. Whoever lost these sick matches would be murdered and then eaten. These were to teach the Hounds the law of service to the Infinite Empire, which was, if you cannot fight and you cannot win, then you would better die trying, as surviving a battle is far worse. Living as a Force Hound was a constant struggle, much like the Sith that would come later. Competition and backstabbing was always encouraged. However, no Force Hound was able to fight or kill one another without issuing a formal challenge. This was up to their Predor owner in order to approve these challenges, and they grew up with no empathy, no compassion, and no mercy. All of this was to cull the weak, so that the Force Hounds who made it to the Predor sides were the strongest that the galaxy could offer. In many ways, the training of a Force Hound was far more sick than even that of the Sith. They were taught solely to seek power through fear and pain, and they were profoundly powerful in the dark side. You see, the task of a Force Hound wasn't just to go and find planets for the Empire to conquer, but they themselves were the first wave of the invasion. Acting as single-soldier armies, Force Hounds would infiltrate whatever world they scouted for their Predors, and they would soften up the resistance by crushing the strongest foes before the main invasion arrived. This process would work miraculously until the Force Hounds encountered the very young Jedi Order, and both sides finally met their match. At the time, the Jedi may have a much deeper understanding of the Force than the Hounds did, having chosen to seek its mysteries in pursuit of balance. But the Hounds knew the Force in a different way. They allowed themselves to be consumed with what would later be known as the dark side. They lived to fight, kill, survive, repeat. To them, they knew the Force as a weapon, one that hung at their belt the same way that their saber did. The Force was not a sense of comfort to them, but a blunt weapon used to conquer and destroy. Having been bred from powerful Force sensitives, they sifted through hundreds of gladiatorial combat matches to find the perfect Hound, and they sometimes received special training or instruction from their own Predor masters, gifted tacticians in the ways of the dark side. The Hound would grow to be strong and to act on their behalf alone. Because of this, during this era, the Hounds had some of the most advanced techniques and understanding of the dark side in the entire galaxy, far more than the Sith did in this era. They were so skilled that two Hounds by the name of Kesh and Trill were capable of defeating several Jedi at once, even go blade to blade with the Jedi Masters. Kesh, which was the strongest of all the Force Hounds, is one we can look at for the peak of their capability. When he sensed and sought out the world of Tython, the home world of the Jedi, his mere approaching presence threw everything on the world into chaos. Many members of the Jedi Order began having visions and hallucinations of a dark entity approaching, causing them to stumble when practicing, or even become distracted when fighting. One of the Dark Jedi, named Dagon Locke, had a vision long ago about a dark warrior appearing on Tython with a sword made of fire. When Kesh landed on Tython, His aura was so dark that it threw the entire planet into a violent force storm. His mere signature and presence unbalanced the fragile world, and once he arrived, he would prove just how powerful he was. He took on 3 Jedi journeyers by himself and nearly defeated all of them, had it not been for one particular warrior, one who disarmed him using his Force Saber against him. For reference, the ancient Jedi Order had a rank in between Padawan that we know of today as Knight. Back then, the Knights were known as Rangers, and this rank was the Journeyer, making this Jedi still somewhat a learner, but one advanced and skilled enough to be on their own, but they still had to adhere to a greater master. It took 3 of these Journeyers, each of them proven to be skilled on their own right, who completely failed to actually put Kesh down. In the battle, Kesh was able to cause an earthquake and a rockfall with telekinesis, and one of the Jedi, who didn't even use a sword because she used the Force as her weapon, caught him in her telekinetic grip. Kesh would overpower her grip and throw her into a wall with his own might in the dark side. To finish it off, he caught a ball of Force lightning with his bare hand, redistributing the lightning back at the group of Journeyers. To put him down required one of the Jedi Masters to get caught up in a Force storm, wielding its power to drop a lightning bolt on top of Kesh from the sky, and even then, he was awake for a few more seconds, refusing to go unconscious. The power of the Hounds were made complete with their weapons, one that became legend, one that would one day become the Lightsaber, at the time known as the Force Saber. Still different than a lightsaber or an archaic proto-saber, these precursor weapons were indeed a cylindrical hilt that still produced a blade of energy. However, no ignition switch and no power source besides the crystal were present. The weapon was powered purely through the use of the dark side and fed off of the Force energy that the wielder conducted. Only by giving into rage and hunger for death and battle could one activate the Force Saber. The flame ignited. None of the blades had different colors, all of them being a single violet indigo. Not much reason is given for this other than it being a literal manifestation of the dark side itself. The Jedi were very cautious of this weapon, and when they captured Kesh and put him within a prison on the moon of Bogan, the master of the alchemy forge Temple of Tython ran his Force Saber through a series of experiments. He ascertained that the hottest fires of his forge couldn't affect the weapon, nor did submerging it in cold water cool the blade. They found out how to activate the weapon by slightly tipping the internal balance towards the darkness, but this gave them much cause for alarm. However, when it was soon revealed that the Empire were on their way to invade Tython, Kesh's heart was softened and his mind changed, and he would then teach the Ancient Order how to mass-produce the Force Saber, using his own saber as a template, with this being the very foundation of the lightsaber of the future. After the fall of the Infinite Empire and the defeat of the Rakata, most of the Force Hounds would die out, and the entire concept was abolished by the galaxy. The only thing that remained of their order was their weapon, one that the Jedi would stop using for a period of time. After the Force Wars with the Infinite Empire concluded, the Jedi would go back to using swords, as the Force Saber were causing massive amounts of them to fall, and the Order would actually use swords for the next couple thousand years, only revisiting the concept of the lightsaber much later. Not wanting to draw upon the dark side to activate their weapon, the Jedi took the concept of a frozen energy blade, but made a makeshift version that included an external power pack connected by a cord. Creating an internal power cell wasn't done until well after the creation of the Sith though, and the process of making the lightsaber that we know today was a long one which took place over the course of thousands of years. But it all came back to this one group of dark side consumed slaves, known as the Force Hounds. But anyway, one of the most memorable things about the Jedi and the Sith orders, other than their organizations, are the places in which they reside. The Ziggurat-style Jedi Temple on Coruscant is one of the most iconic locations in the galaxy, and we've had the pleasure of exploring many other Jedi structures in various locations which serve as enclaves, libraries, sanctuaries, and even tombs in some cases. They are quiet places which promote serenity and looking outside of oneself at the Force around them. But on the flip side, side, locations which are completely shrouded in mystery are the Sith temples. We hear of them only as fables, places filled with shadow and evil, where unspeakable horrors are carried out and untold secrets of the dark side are explored. Rarely do we ever get to actually get a peek of what's inside of these temples, except for maybe the ones on Korriban. But one thing many have in common is the terrifying way that they've been constructed. Our researchers have noted that many Sith temples have a dual purpose, being both a housing place and something as a double weapon. So, join us today as we open a holocron and delve into the secrets of the construction of the Sith temples. In ancient times, the Sith purebloods insisted on building their temples in a pyramidal fashion, a common thing amongst many Sith temples to this very day. It was said that the sloping angles pointed towards a single top, and this was meant to represent the power structure of Sith culture. But that's not the only thing. Ancient Sith runes were carved into the sides of the pyramid, which would actually channel the arcane energies of the Force towards a single point at the very heart of the Sith temple. With each angle of the mausoleums focusing their energy inward, Sorza Sin described just standing at the intersection of a temple gave her a feeling like a rush of wind and a shiver of electricity. It was at these points where many ancient Sith lords would conduct their powerful magical rituals to create dark artifacts and develop terrifying spells that we know today. One may equate this construction to being similar to that of a Sith holocron. And if you did, then you've made a very astute observation, because the construction of Sith holocrons would actually be based off of the construction of the Sith temples, rune carvings included. This is why many temples that you see nowadays, such as the ones on Malachor, are actually identical to giant holocrons. This bit of information tells us everything we need to know about the Sith themselves and their pursuits within the Force. When you compare it with the Jedi, their opposing ideologies really stand out from one another. The Jedi temple's construction is built upon a wellspring in the Force, and it's made to evenly distribute those energies throughout the entire temple, just as the Jedi equally share their knowledge in the Force. Whereas the Sith temple selfishly channels all of that energy inwards towards a single point in the temple where only the Dark Lord is allowed to wield it. Jedi temples are largely left empty, save for their archives of knowledge, with plenty of space for practice and meditation. But Sith temples are often filled with treasure and dark artifacts which house dangerous spirits. Jedi temples have gardens which promote life and serenity, but many Sith temples are tombs with dangerous traps that worship the dead and represent struggle for survival. It's truly amazing when we really break down how different these temples are and show us the very nature of one another. But like we said earlier, the Sith temples aren't just for channeling power, but oftentimes they serve as a secondary purpose, as a weapon. The first one we have to talk about is one that you're likely already thinking of, the Temple of Malachor. This place was constructed by Darthanis many thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin. This is in canon continuity, so the exact date is shaky, but it was alleged to have been at least built in the year 3966 BBY, and if this is true, then we could line up that with Legends continuity as well, and place its construction right during the wave of the Great Galactic War, which would make a lot of sense. The temple was built to resemble a holocron at the very apex, which housed a massive kyber crystal capable of destroying massive amounts of life. Darthanis had her own holocron used as the key to activate this temple, which would turn into a massive ship with a superweapon. The Jedi Crusaders had caught wind of this terrible construct and rushed to put an end to it during an event which would later be known as the Great Scourge of Mandalore. The Jedi Crusaders would lead a raid on the temple, killing as many Sith as they could in order to put an end to their villainous plot. But during the battle, the superweapon fired, turning every Jedi and Sith into statues of hardened ash. Many Sith temples either had weapons or doubled as weapons themselves. Some, like the Temple of Malachor, made the weapon its primary function. But others, such as the Fortress of Darth Revan, had large weapons as a means of self-defense. Revan's Sith Fortress is one that is more intricately constructed once he made his full-time place of residence and research. Much like Darth Plagueis, Darth Revan was a scientist. and it was this fortress on the planet of Almas that would terraform the desolate world with a plant known as the Kaluthan. This plant would actually remove the poisonous atmosphere of Almas and make the planet habitable for settlers to stay. Everywhere, except for a desert around Riven's fortress, was covered with massive amounts of grass and foliage. Knowing that a Sith actually did some good for a planet for a change definitely makes this temple one of the more interesting reads, and how the Sith promoted growth, progress, and light. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, as there were still great horrors that were left within the fortress. On the subject of weaponry, Riven's fortress had the capability to fire huge bolts of Sith lightning from the top, with the range reaching all the way into space. This weapon would actually remain active even after Riven's death. Many places inside the temple was made of Beskar in order to protect his ancient knowledge, but the whole place doubled as a prison. He kept many test subjects in his dungeons, including a single Jedi, none of whom could escape due to the walls of the dungeon having the ability to block the Force. Riven liked to watch his prisoners wallow in despair and give up on all hope as they slowly went insane from being unable to touch the Force. He would even do this to his own apprentice, going as far as to trap her spirit inside of the temple as well. All of this is documented in the autobiography, which is inscribed on the walls of his fortress in the Sith language. Indeed, my friends, Sith temples often boasted not just weaponry, but twisted uses as well. Riven's fortress may have cut Jedi inside off from the Force, driving them crazy, but there was a temple that actively punished Jedi for even being in its mere presence. I'm afraid that we're going to once again have to mention one of the most vile planets in the galaxy, Zygula. The temple that resided on this planet nearly killed Obi-Wan himself, and there wasn't even a single Sith present there. For the full story and effect though, definitely check out the Clone Wars wild space novel. But to put it simply, the Temple of Zygula was a smaller one, being more so a small tower. It had no floors inside of it, but was completely hollow, housing many books, crystals, and Sith treasures. The real prize though, was the vicious holocron that lay inside, a holocron which hated Jedi and actively killed any of them that got near. The temple itself was constructed to amplify the power of this holocron, and when Obi-Wan and Bail Organa crash-landed on Zygula, Obi-Wan was mentally tortured in the most depraved and excruciating way possible. He was thrown into fits and visions where he would be forced to relive some of the most horrific moments in his life, experiencing all of the feelings all over again. He was blocked out from being able to use the light side, and would have frequent hallucinations. When he wasn't dealing with this, a voice constantly chanted in the Jedi's mind, "Die, Jedi, die," either as a whisper or as a full-on scream. The only way to get the voices and the visions to stop was to hurt himself in some way. And by the time Obi-Wan and Bail made it to the temple, Obi-Wan was far too weak. Just by merely looking at the temple when they got close enough, caused Kenobi to pass out and experience the worst fits of his visions by far, to the point where he almost didn't wake back up. The Zygula temple might be the most sinister one by far, and it didn't just want to kill Jedi, it wanted to utterly destroy them, to cut them off from the light side of the Force, mentally torture them until they gave into the dark side, and gave up who they were, before finally granting them a slow and an agonizing death. But what about the ones that didn't have any violent uses at all? Were there any Sith temples that actually tried to make their use as one of progression within the Force? Well, for that, we have to look at our final entry on the list, Vader's castle. In canon, Vader would have his castle built upon a Force nexus by the spirit of Darth Maulman, an ancient Sith architect who possessed his mask upon his death. Anyone who wore the mask of Maulman would become possessed by the spirit. And coming across the mask as a gift from Palpatine, Vader would strike a deal with Maulman whenever he possessed one of the Imperial officers. Maulman would build Vader's castle in such a way that it would use the Nexus to basically open a portal through the Force. Theoretically, this would bring back any spirit to the physical world in their regular body. I think you know where this is going. Vader, of course, wanted to resurrect Padme, and this was his final attempt. After 9 failed castle projects, Maulman finally perfected it and opened the portal. Vader got to at least see Padme before Maulman betrayed him and used the portal to bring back his own body instead. He would then duel Vader and lose. In the process, the portal inside Vader's castle would be destroyed, and with it went his final chance to get Padme back. And that, my friends, is the terrifying construction of Sith temples. It's very intriguing to see many different uses that the Sith have for their temples, from weaponry, prisons, power amplifiers, and even portals into the Force. The Sith clearly exercised their knowledge of the dark side's secrets to create some of the most shocking structures imaginable, and we often read about how the Celestials and the Rakata were known as the Builders, creating extremely powerful projects such as the Starforge, and it seems like this kind of power and knowledge is attainable to modern Force sensitives as well. However, the Sith proved that time and time again, with dedication and much study, these kinds of projects are still possible. But as Luke says, the Sith only ever see things in the negative, which in this case is their greatest flaw. If they applied their incredible knowledge of arcane architecture towards the positive, they could have absolutely changed the galaxy. The Jedi could, and probably should be doing this, but they don't go far enough with their knowledge, which is also a flaw in our opinion. But of course, what do you think? Do you know that we are going to be discussing a group of the most animalistic and barbaric wielders of the dark side in all of Legends lore, a group that predates the Sith as we know them, known as the Flesh Raiders. The ancient Rakata species of the Infinite Empire were some of the most terrifying beings in galactic history, but also some of the most influential, thousands of years after their societal collapse and the technology that they left behind, as well as all of the damage that shaped the galaxy that we know it today. The Rakata were extremely powerful worshippers of the dark side itself, but there was one thing that they left behind that wasn't exactly conducive to development, and that was known as the Flesh Raiders. These abhorrent monsters were left behind on the Jedi's ancestral homeworld of Tython, and when the Jedi came back to roost during the Cold War of the Old Republic to their old home, they were met with a lot of trouble from the Flesh Raiders. These creatures posed a significant threat to the Jedi, despite not even having the ability to touch the Force. So where did the Flesh Raiders come from? Why were they such a vicious species? Well, today we are going to open a holocron and talk about it. But before we dive in, our long-range scanners have picked up some unregistered life forms. Some of you who are listening have not yet subscribed, so if you've been enjoying our daily uploads of lore from a galaxy far, far away, be sure to force crush that subscribe button and become an acolyte today. Now, let us analyze the Flesh Raiders. The Flesh Raiders first get their start much in the same way that the Force Hounds did, as we talked about some time ago in a video. They were slaves and a servant caste in the Rakatan society. However, unlike the Hounds, which were beings that were bred and taken from conquered planets, the Flesh Raiders were technically a part of the Rakata race. They were a mutated subspecies of Rakata, which had huge hulking bodies and very low intelligence. Though, while less inclined towards the Force than the other Rakatan overlords, it seemed as though they were able to touch the Force in some amount, because of course they had the ability to activate Force sabers, with the weapon being the archaic ancestor of the lightsaber as we know it, and was a weapon that could only be activated when channeling the dark side. Their sabers bore a yellow color to set them apart from the Force Hounds, which had an indigo color. When they were in the service of the Rakata, they operated much in the same way that the Masasi did for the pure-blooded Sith. This was as serving as the bulk of the workforce and of the military. These Flesh Raiders were better at following orders than they were at ruling, which is why they were largely servants. Despite their humanoid shape, their intelligence was borderline animalistic, and that is why when the Infinite Empire was deteriorating, the Flesh Raiders seemed to devolve even farther. A large collection of them were left on Tython following the end of the invasion, and since the Jedi had also left the planet, the Raiders were pretty much allowed to grow their society on the world, though it wasn't advanced by any means. They remained primitive, tribalistic, and used whatever they could find as armor and weaponry, usually sticks and animal skins. The Flesh Raiders followed some kind of religion, as they had shamans who carved stone idols, but it wasn't ever really made clear what this religion was. To mark their territories, they would scorch the grass and trees that surrounded them, and scatter the bones of their sentient and non-sentient prey. Soon, they would start making a real problems for themselves when they were given blasters by an unknown benefactor. The Jedi, who had established themselves back on Tython, were quickly met by the Flesh Raiders. The Raiders, who marked war against the Jedi and continuously attacked their temples. It was said that the Flesh Raiders also hauled off a young Jedi Padawan tortured them, and then brutally killed them. And what that young man saw on the last day of his life was likely unspeakable. They would then continue to hunt down and capture more and more Padawans, hoping to send a brutal, devastating message to the Jedi. From the tests that the Jedi Order ran on the Flesh Raiders, they deduced that they were a cannibalistic people who had been driven maddened by violence through dark means. The reasons are unknown, with many Jedi researchers speculating that Sith experimentation may have something to do with it. But the Flesh Raiders had become vicious and unreasonable. The Jedi continued to struggle training some of their students due to the Flesh Raider population, since they couldn't move freely around Tython without getting attacked and ambushed by hunting parties. One-on-one, a seasoned Jedi Knight could take down a Flesh Raider, but the problem was with just how many there were, as there were massive groups of them that populated Tython with varying tribes. The problem was only made far worse when a student in the Jedi Temple who had embraced the dark side was giving them weaponry and paths into Jedi territory. Unfortunately, the Jedi weren't able to simply deal with them by wiping them out, and although they were dangerously hostile, they were still life forms, and the Jedi Code at the time did not permit genocide of any kind. So for the entirety of their stay on Tython, the Jedi only acted out of self-defense when they would enter their territories, and they attempted to do what they could to keep their temples and their own land free of the raiders. This may be the end of the story about this issue, except for one unique occurrence. During the end of the Cold War, something completely unprecedented was discovered. A member of the Flesh Raider species was found with force sensitivity and with a high amount. And not only this, but he had intelligence that none of the others had, as well as seemingly no hostile tendencies. His name was Fashik, and the Jedi discovered him when they were looking into the disappearance of a Twi'lek boy. He had been abducted by Fashik, but not for bad or nefarious reasons. When the Jedi found him, the boy was unharmed and serving as an interpreter for Fashik, who at the time was unable to speak Basic. Fashik expressed that he knew of the Force and saw how the Jedi wielded it. He didn't want to live the violent and cruel life of his brethren, but instead wanted to learn how to use these abilities with the Jedi. He expressed how he abandoned the Flesh Raiders and wanted to use his powers in the Force to become a better hunter. The Jedi agreed to take him back and to have him evaluated by the Jedi High Council, as it was better to do that than then leave him on his own, with the Jedi being fearful that he would come to embrace the dark side. Fearful of what a great leader of the Flesh Raiders that could possess the dark side of the Force could bring upon the Jedi Order and Tython. But there is something incredibly beautiful and important about Fashik, something that marked a substantial change in the Star Wars galaxy. Centuries ago, the Rakata had lost their ability to touch the Force due to a mysterious virus. The thing that had made them so powerful was stripped from them. It was assumed that this included the Flesh Raiders as well. And for generations, none of them could touch the Force whatsoever. The fact that Fashik had sentience and could touch the Force was an astounding discovery. He was something special. Unfortunately, what occurred is not known after this, but we do know that Fashik saved the life of the young Twi'lek boy, stopping the other Flesh Raiders from devouring him. Unfortunately, the history following this has not been recorded, but we can only assume that he was permitted for training, and likely even became a Jedi. It was doubtful that he was ever on the front lines of the war though, as it was believed that they wanted to keep any kind of Flesh Raider away from the Sith and the power that the Flesh Raiders could offer, the ability to hunt and kill Jedi in droves. Being a Rakata also meant that Fashik was still innately more inclined to the dark side itself, and his fall would have been exceptionally easy. But anyway, my friends, who was the dark armored warrior Warb Null? How did his armor become one of the most dangerous Sith artifacts in history? Greetings, Acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. 3,998 years before the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy was a much different place. Ancient galactic civilization had many strange figures within it, besides just the Jedi and the Sith. One of these figures was a towering warrior in ebony armor calling himself Warb Null. Warb Null wielded a great saber so large that the hilt alone was longer than an average man's torso. We first learn of Warb Null during the Friedan Nad Uprising, and then later in the Tales of the Jedi Legends comic. Upon first glance, Warb Null is more of a brute serving the ancient dead Sith Lord Friedan Nad, and in the story he is killed rather quickly. However, Noel himself is not entirely the focus here, but rather, his armor is, some of the most powerful and important armor in all of the history of the Sith. From the moment the armor is forged to the moment we lose track of Warb Noel in the history books, the Noel armor leaves a trail of horror and blood in its wake. And today, my friends, we are going to explore the lesser known character of Warb Noel, talk about how dangerous his Sith magic was, and how dangerous Sith magic can be when implemented perfectly into the armor of a dark champion. The origins of Warb Noel begin at an unknown point prior to the events of the Freed Nad uprising in 3998 BBY. Originally, he was a young man by the name of Shas Dovos. Dovos was a metallurgy prodigy who had big dreams in his field of blacksmithing. All of these dreams, though, would change when he stumbled across an ancient Sith tome and began to decipher it, fascinated by its teachings. After a decade of painstaking study and work, Dovos would become determined to unlock the secrets of this book, convinced now that it was his destiny. His fascination with the book slowly turned to an obsession over it. He could feel it calling to him, urging him, to the point where he felt destined to merge the knowledge in the tome with his own skill in blacksmithing, creating an armor in the power of the dark side and in its name. Dovos shunned everything else in his life just to work on this armor. He left his family, his friends, and even refused to eat. His full origin is revealed to us in the Tales of the Jedi Companion sourcebook, where it opens on Dovos in his workshop, painstakingly hammering away at his armor. He had not even realized at this point that 4 days had passed since he had begun. So consumed was he in the dark masterpiece that nothing else mattered to him, not even sleep. At last, his final hammer swing fell, and the armor was complete. Dovos marveled at his creation, speculating on if he ever even held the right to wear it, considering he had to steal the sorcery necessary to create it. This power was not his. He even began to wonder how he even accomplished this feat, awestruck due to the fact he had no skill in Sith magic whatsoever. We aren't told if Dovos was Force sensitive or not, but it is reasonable to assume that he has at least a passing knowledge of sensitivity, and a modicum of it considering the tome was able to call out to him and corrupt his mind. Non-Force sensitives aren't able to have Force powers channeled through their bodies except through very specific circumstances, so it is more than likely that Dovos has simply never been trained in the ways of the Force, but had the gift innately. But that was when his confirmation was given to him, as an orb of magnificent light hovered towards the young blacksmith. A sinister voice boomed from it and told him that he would wear the armor. Dovos was terrified at first, and his fear only grew when the orb of light expanded into the form of a floating Sith spirit. Once again, the source material here is vague on exactly who the specter was. However, using our context clues, such as the fact that all of this is taking place on Onderon, and there was only one Sith in memory to have been intrinsically tied to Onderon, it is likely that the apparition that appeared before Dovos was none other than the mighty Freed Nad. The two then begin to speak, where the spirit reveals that it was he who put it in Dovos' dream that the armor was his destiny, and it was Freedon who even gave Dovos the ability to use Sith magic to craft the beautiful creation. Simply put, the Sith Spectre was openly admitting to possessing and manipulating Dovos for the simple fact of this armor being created. Freedon was the one that protected the tome and kept it from crumbling to dust all these years later, hoping it would be found by some victim. It was then that the spirit unveiled his plans for Dovos as he swooped towards the metalworker, the armor pieces coming to life and binding to his flesh. Dovos would become known as Warb Noel, a magical merging of man and metal, a merging of man and alchemy. Dovos could do nothing but scream as his entire life and identity was stripped from him, and his life essence was infused into the very armor itself. Warb Noel was born, and the mighty warrior would become a servant of the spirit of Freedon and a fierce combatant on the battlefield. When Warb Noel appears, he shows up wielding a massive great saber. His origin story is silent on how he actually acquired this magnificent weapon, but we can figure that it was more than likely that he killed a Jedi and took the crystal from their lightsaber, considering that Warb Noel's lightsaber was green. This actually would not be a surprise at all, since the Jedi were a lot more spread out during the era of Warb Noel, and Noel was more than capable of defeating a lone Jedi. His armor, as you may have guessed, was infused with a plethora of abilities that made Warb Noel a towering terror. The armor had increased whatever force sensitivity Dovydas once possessed by nearly 5 to 10 times. It essentially drew the force in and funneled it inside his body, allowing him to contend with seasoned Jedi masters. The armor itself also had a certain amount of lightsaber resistance. Not complete immunity, but it was apparently able to shrug off glancing blows, and only direct hits at certain spots on the armor would actually cut it. Along with this, the armor was enchanted with some sort of passive tutaminis, as it was able to absorb and then dissipate certain levels of energy. This is likely what gave it the resistance to lightsabers as well. But the most interesting ability that the armor possessed was its aura. This aura brought despair, agony, and dismay to the opponents of Warb Null. When Null was around, his mere presence was an oppressive force that made the strength and resolve of a Jedi weaken. The first we ever see of Warb Null is when he arrives on Onderon following the end of the Beast Wars. After having defeated the Wicked Queen of Onderon, who was a servant of Frida Nad, the Jedi were planning to remove Nad's sarcophagus to the moon on Duxun, hoping to purify the planet of Frida Nad's influence. That is when the cult called the Nadists came up from the ground and attacked the Jedi. Leading the charge and making his grand entrance was Warb Null. The Black Knight would proceed to engage not one, not two, but 3 highly skilled Jedi in combat all at once. Ulic Qel-Droma, his brother Kay, and Os Willem, student of venerated Master Thrawn. These Jedi teamed up against Null, and although they were all fierce Jedi, they could not put a scratch in his armor. The battle was short, as the Nadist cultists' only objective was to secure the sarcophagus, and as soon as that happened, Null retreated. Later, Warb Null would return once again when the Jedi went to confront the King Amin of Onderon. The king was believed to have been a servant of Frida Nad, and when this was revealed, Amin would trap Master Arca Jeth. At that moment, Null entered the scene once again, enraged by Amin and what he had done to his master. Ulic Qel-Droma would then engage Warb Null by himself in one-on-one combat. The duel was legendary and fierce, and Ulic felt his strength diminish with every crashing blow from Warb Null, from the monstrous Dark Titan. But suddenly, Ulic felt a burst of energy. Adjusting his lightsaber, Ulic made one decisive cut, driving the blade straight through the right arm and neck of Warb Null, decapitating the Titan instantly. It was revealed that the neck of Warb Null was his weak spot in the armor, and was not as strongly enforced with energy and the dissipation properties as the rest of the armor was. The death of this Dark Knight was swift. Despite the epic and terrifying origins of Warb Null, his career was ultimately disappointingly brief, though this anticlimactic defeat was not the end of his story. The armor of Warb Null would be lost to history, lying dormant on the forgotten backwater planet known as Nichat Ka in a tomb, likely the tomb of Dovydas. This tomb wouldn't be uncovered until the very final days of the Clone Wars, when a couple of Jedi archaeologists would come across it. A young Jedi by the name of Talati Killiman was a member of the Jedi Explorer Corps, and hated his life because of it. He was proven to be so much weaker than the rest of the Jedi of his class, and when he was a youngling, he had openly failed his trials. Every single one of the masters looked at him, and then passed up on him for training, including the one that he looked up to the most, Master Yarael. He now spent his life excavating old ruins, but after the Battle of Geonosis, Yarael retired from the service as a Jedi Guardian and became a part of the Explorer Corps, now reunited with the individual that looked up to him so many years ago. The Jedi were sent to a Sith excavation site, and while they were doing their work, Talati would go off on his own to explore the rest of the tomb, growing bored with whatever work the Jedi had him do. But this is when he found it. Sitting in a large stone chair was the suit, the armor, missing the right gauntlet and having a large scar on the neck. The armor of Warb Null lay before the young Jedi. Despite having been there for thousands of years, there was not a single speck of dust on Warb Null's armor, as if all the dust in the room refused to land on it. Talati then saw the great saber hilt sitting before the armor's feet, and greatly desired to wield it. He had always wanted a lightsaber, but was unable to construct one due to him not being a real Jedi. He determined to thieve the saber for himself, as it called out to him yet again. He could hear the whispers of the ancient Sith Lords, promising power beyond any Jedi. He reached forward, but suddenly, the armor itself lurched forward and attempted to grab the young Jedi initiate. Talati quickly pulled away, causing the armor to come crashing off the chair and kicking up a huge dust cloud. That was when Talati would be accosted by visions of times past. He would see the ancient Sith, red-skinned aliens holding spears, chanting, throwing them, hoping to strike down an invading ship. Several gray-skinned aliens all being mercilessly chopped down with a massive axe. The red aliens constantly chanted, Adis, Adis, Adis. Talati was literally watching the defense of Korriban from the Rakata by King Adis himself, the first Sith king. For those who do not know, King Adis was a Dark Lord of the Sith that lived many thousands of years before even the Second Great Schism. He is one of the first Sith Lords ever, and one of the most powerful. He was famous for rallying the warring tribes of the Sith pureblood species together to repel the attack on his people by the Rakata. It is a hugely important piece of galactic history, and Talati was watching it all unfold in this vision, witnessing the conclusion of the Reign of the Axe. The vision would then show him the hammer striking the metal when the armor was forged by Dovydas, before again switching back to him in the Beast Wars of Onderon. It was in this moment that Talati watched Ulic Qel-Droma kill Warb Null, only from Null's perspective now. To Talati, it was as if Ulic was slicing right through his own neck instead. When the Jedi Initiate awoke from these visions, he was wearing the armor and had the helmet poised above his head, ready to wear it himself. That's when he heard the voice of the old Jedi Master that had rejected him, with his lightsaber drawn, commanding the Jedi Initiate to remove the armor. Now, fueled by the massive power of the dark side of the Force, Talati's mind turned to anger and spite. His desire to be a part of the Clone Wars, to make a difference in the galaxy, to be a hero. All of these feelings rose to the surface, and his hatred for the Explorer Corps, his detest of the Jedi Master before him, and the fury of being passed over time and time again by the Jedi finally boiled to the surface. Talati screamed, demanding the Master tell him why he was passed over in the apprentice trials, with the Jedi Master bowing his head and saying that they would speak of it later. But Talati was now fully consumed by all of the promises that the armor was whispering to him, all of the ways he could use the power of the armor to crush the Separatists, become the hero of the Clone War, to prove the Jedi wrong. Talati donned the helmet in defiance, ignoring the burning pain that it caused him, before attacking the Jedi Master. The two would have a brief duel in the tomb chambers, but Talati quickly realized how much faster, stronger, and more powerful the armor had made him. The armor was funneling the Force into his body like a drug. He could see all of the memories and experience of Frida Nad, King Adis even, and Dovydas. However, when the Jedi Master was being beaten back, he suddenly gained a new piece, and began to put up more of a formidable challenge against the new Warb Null. The Jedi Master had centered himself, and now he had become a legitimate threat. Talati was forced back and down to one knee before he activated a secret trick that the armor had whispered to him. A secret about Warb Null's lightsaber, a hidden emitter shroud by the pommel, which held a secret second blade. Where the traditional blade of Warb Null's greatsaber was green, the hidden blade was crimson red, revealing that the weapon of Warb Null was not a greatsaber, but a saber staff in secret all along. A final gift and deception from the armor. Catching the Jedi Master off guard, Talati swiftly used the trick to slice through his jugular. The fallen Jedi was elated as he began to listen to all of the dark whispers telling him of all the great things that he could do with his new power. However, it was in this moment that a chime came from the Jedi Master's comlink. It was Chancellor Palpatine. Palpatine telling all the Jedi that the war had ended and to return to Coruscant immediately. In this very moment, all of Talati's dreams of heroism came crashing down, and he lost himself to his fury. He then declared that he would not be returning to Coruscant, that he was no longer a Jedi. There was always war somewhere, and he would go and find it. It was his new purpose. Talati was dead. He now named himself Malleus, the Hammer of the Dark Side. The story comes from the magazine Star Wars Insider number 147, and unfortunately, this is where the story of Malleus ends, along with the armor of Warb Null. I honestly hate that nothing ever came of this origin. The setup was absolutely perfect for a book, comic, or even a TV series. I think Malleus would have been an excellent villain as a Jedi who survived Order 66 but had turned to the dark side prior, roaming the galaxy as a dark warrior in a massive suit of armor. If you could imagine a show or a game set during the time centered around Order 66, maybe even Cal Kestis could encounter Malleus. Or perhaps the Dark Warrior could have his own planet in the Outer Rim or the Unknown Regions. There could even be a possibility that Malleus is only discovered in this new era of canon in the events after Return of the Jedi. We could see an arc where Ezra has to continue his training, leading him to train with Luke, and then the two of them go off on an adventure in search of Jedi knowledge, or artifacts, leading them right into a full-scale war with Malleus, who is now obsessed with fighting and killing Jedi. There would be an opportunity to explore the Sith spirits in canon, as well as maybe even a few flashback sequences of the Freed and Nad Uprising and King Adus. While speculating stories is interesting, one thing we found very important was the state of Warb Null's lightsaber. In the original comic, it was a large green greatsaber, and the change to it being a saber staff only happened in this new story. However, this opens up a continuity hole, since Warb Null actually comes before Exar Kun, who is famous for being the inventor of the double-bladed lightsaber. Not to mention, most lightsabers used in this era only used the traditional Jedi colors such as green and blue, since the knowledge of creating Sith synthetic red crystals had not been recovered yet. I think the only explanation is this is a feature that Warb Null did not put in the lightsaber himself, but rather someone else added to it after his death. Why someone would do this to a lightsaber that was not their own, and would simply go on to bury it, is anyone's guess. Either way, the state of Warb Null's lightsaber construction is surrounded with mystery, especially since we don't even know how he got it in the first place. It's not mentioned that Dovydas crafted the lightsaber along with the armor. But anyway, my friends, greetings, curious acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to our archives. Since we have dusted off many of our old records that date back to the early time of the Sith purebloods of Korriban, there was something else that caught the eye of our researchers. There were a couple of different species that inhabited Korriban and the rest of the Sith Empire during the time of Ajunta Pal in the First Dark Jedi, and even further beyond. Living right alongside the Sith purebloods was a race known as the Massassi. When Ajunta Pal and his followers established their rule on Korriban, they quickly went to work enslaving what they deemed to be the lesser species of the purebloods, and put them to work. Among these would be the small and feeble Grothu and the brutish Massassi. When talking about the old Sith Empire, many scholars only really seem to pay attention to the Sith themselves, and neglect to pay mention to those whose backs the Sith Empire was really built on. So, sit with us today as we do a quick dive into the overlooked species, and explain exactly what the Sith did with the ranks among them that were not Force sensitive. The Massassi were a subspecies that were relatives of the Sith purebloods, and so they shared a lot of similarities to the Sith. However, there were a few key details that set them apart from their Sith cousins. Firstly, they were far larger and had much more exaggerated features. They're very similar to the way that humans view Neanderthals and the evolution of the species. The Massassi had heavy brows, forward jaws, and even spikes that protruded from various points on their bodies. They could also be told apart as they had solid yellow eyes without any real pupils. They had their own sort of society and even their own language, so it wasn't as though they were just a different kind of Sith, they were indeed their own species entirely. The Massassi were hulking brutes of relatively low intelligence, but absolutely fierce battle instincts. Being a race that admired power above all, the Sith purebloods were a society that quickly proved themselves to be the superiors and would force any other species on the planet to serve beneath them. Interestingly though, it seemed to be the Massassi that they were pretty content serving their Sith masters, as they revered the Sith Lords as gods and worshipped them with their slave labor. One of the most key features about the Massassi is that they were absolutely loyal to a fault, and once they pledged their worship, it was their tradition that they would stay with whoever their god was until death, which wasn't very long for them in most cases. Massassi had remarkably short lifespans compared to other humanoid species in the galaxy, with their adolescence only lasting the first 10 years, and the prime of their life being somewhere around 15. Once a Massassi had reached 25, they were middle-aged, and most of them died shortly reaching after the age of 50. The Sith Lords of Korriban filled their ranks with Massassi and created entire armies of the brutes that served their function quite efficiently. Despite being of low intelligence, Massassi excelled remarkably at carrying out complex orders and military strategies, so long as each group was assigned a handler to keep them in line. Being relatives of the Sith species, the Massassi also had a very strong affinity for the Force, and because of it, they were basically naturally bred super soldiers. They were so effective, in fact, this Sors's Sin referred to them as their greatest asset. Entire starships were crewed by Massassi during the Great Hyperspace War, and despite the Sith losing this war, the Massassi fought admirably against the Republic forces. During this war, one of the main Sith Lords that the Massassi revered as their god would be Naga Sadow, and upon his order, those that crewed the other ships of the Sith fleet turned on their Sith pureblood leaders and murdered them in the name of Sadow, taking over their ships and pledging them to the Sith Emperor. Long after his exile, Naga Sadow took a great many Massassi warriors with him to the world of Yavin 4, where Sadow actually began to use Sith alchemy to mutate and alter them. They became deranged and disturbed monsters, growing in size and bulk as well as sporting a few new fin-like growths on their heads and backs. This also turned what intelligence they had down even further, until they were basically mindless brutes and servants. After Naga Sadow's death, the Massassi on Yavin 4 devolved into being a primitive hunter-warrior type society until the coming of the great Exar Kun. Whenever Exar Kun arrived to the world of Yavin 4, he quickly established himself as their new god and commanded them to build numerous grand temples in his honor. One of these temples would be the very same one that the rebellion would temporarily make a base of operations out of in the latter years of the Galactic Civil War. According to legend, some of the spirits of the Massassi remained trapped in these temples, and by the accounts of Luke Skywalker, some rebel soldiers and pilots reported hearing strange noises, having nightmares, and seeing things in the halls of this temple during the duration of their stay. Taking looks at different species and things like these are an important step to fully understanding the grand picture of how the Sith Empire ran in these ancient eras of the galaxy. What's most tragic about the Massassi is those that were not Force sensitive were deemed even lower than Massassi that were, as the Sith purebloods valued power and the dark side of the Force itself above everything, with the Massassi believing that the Sith purebloods' ability to touch the Force was their greatest asset. This is why, if a Massassi warrior was not Force sensitive at all, they would be worked till death or put to death instantaneously, essentially being the absolute lowest on the totem pole, as the Massassi worshipped power essentially as their god, and their power was the dark side of the Force itself. What's important to note though is that the Massassi were naturally Force sensitive, so although it did occur, it was highly rare for one to be born without the gifts of the Force. However, if one was, they were the lepers of the society, believing that they had sinned against their masters and were a great plague. The Massassi warriors literally fed on the powers of the dark side, so those that could not touch it meant nothing. The Massassi were nicknamed the terrors of the battlefield among the Sith purebloods, and when the Dark Jedi arrived, they knew instantly that the Massassi were the lowest on the totem pole, despite perhaps being more useful than the purebloods themselves. They were not intelligent, but their ability to touch the dark side was just as potent, and they were considered invaluable to the ranks of the Dark Jedi. Even among the ranks of the more modern Sith, the Massassi warriors are held in high regard, as they were believed to be some of the greatest wielders of the pure energies of the dark side of the Force, although they were not very advanced whatsoever. But anyway, my friends,
today we wanted to take a look at one of the most terrifying zombie ships in all of the lore, a ship that appropriately belonged to Darth Nihilus, the Lord of Hunger. Greetings, Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. Every Dark Lord needs their ship, from the alchemically enhanced capital ship of Naga Sadow, with the power to make a sun go supernova, to Vader's multi-city-sized Executor. The flagships of the Sith are not just how they get around, it's how they introduce themselves. The size, power, and even look of the ships are meant to invoke a very specific type of fear and intimidation on their enemies. But perhaps there is no other ship that invokes fear quite like the ship in today's holocron, Darth Nihilus's Ravager. Many folklore tales exist around the galaxy of so-called ghost ships floating around from one sector to another, the darkness between the stars. But somehow, the most famous planet-eating Sith Lord made his nightmare a reality. The Ravager was, in every sense, a literal zombie ship brought back from the grave. From the moment Nihilus escaped the ruins of Malachor V, all the way to his very last battle at Telos 4, the Ravager stayed with him all this time, as it had no other choice. And today, we are going to be looking at the galaxy's most horrific and terrifying ship, and explaining why the ship of Nihilus takes him to a whole nother level. The origins of the Ravager are quite simple. Initially, it was one of the Republic ships that served during the Mandalorian Wars under the Jedi Revan. It was a Centurion-class battlecruiser, which was rendered basically inoperable after being so heavily shot by Mandalorian weaponry. When the mass shadow generator was activated on Malachor, the Ravager would be one of the many ships yanked straight out of orbit, colliding with the planet's surface. Soon after Nihilus awoke and began to feed, becoming the monster that we know, he would find the dead ship lying on the surface of Malachor. Then, using the dark side of the Force instinctively, he would lift the ship from its grave and make it space-worthy yet again. This sounds simple, but we need to be very clear about the scope of what just happened. Nihilus literally pulled an entire ship out of the ground and is making it fly. The ship was destroyed completely. There are many holes in the hull, bearing the wounds of the Mandalorian War. Yet, Nihilus is using the Force to hold it together, giving it strength, the power for the engines to function. This ship flies through space, which is astounding considering the amount of massive holes and damage that the ship has had, especially considering the size of the ship. Massive damage in the hull, enough to fly other ships completely through. All of these holes are just exposed to open space. As the Ravager drifts through the darkness between the stars, electricity sparks and sputters out of its open wounds. Energy sparks in the dimly lit corridors of the ship, laying abandoned and tattered. Most of the normal computer systems in the ship are completely offline and covered in dust, with the only parts of the ship that has any semblance of operation being the bridge and one single hangar. In order to make the ship even moderately habitable though, although the husk of a man the Sith did not need it, he allowed the particle fields to remain online to create a minimal atmosphere. But other than this, there was very little life support systems on board. This was because the only two beings with mortal souls that actually lived on the ship were Nihilus' shadow hand, Visas Mar, and the Onderonian colonel, Tobin. The rest of the ship was crewed and staffed by literal zombies, corpses, undead beings that Nihilus took control of with the Force and made his slaves. They all stayed on the bridge, endlessly operating the ship, ensuring it survives even in death. Because Nihilus controlled both the ship and its crew, one may say that the zombie pilots of the Ravager were a single decomposing organism. They were driven and held together by the will of one being, already a horrific figure in and of himself, but this zombie ship was literally a living hell. What's more astounding is that despite being a dead ship, the Ravager was surprisingly formidable. From what we understand, its deflector shields were not operational, yet the ship would withstand a heavy assault of blaster fire from energy starcrafts and even other Republic ships. The Ravager was so strong that during the Battle of Telos 4, the Republic and the Mandalorians were forced to make an alliance, and the Mandalorians sent a small strike team inside of the Ravager to set charges. They had to blow the ship up from the inside because they were not able to bring it down the normal way from the exterior. Without deflector shields, we can only imagine that this was yet another one of Nihilus' tricks and the dark side at use. Somehow his ability to hold the ship together also reinforced the whole based off of his Force and his will alone. Some have even speculated that once the spirit of Darth Nihilus began to drift away, torn apart by the dark side, and the Sith Lord was forced to conceal his spirit within his mask and robes, that during this ritual, Darth Nihilus also systematically imparted his spirit against his very ship. The Ravager was a part of Nihilus, forever tied to his power, and the only thing connecting him to the living world. On top of consuming entire planets, Nihilus made his arrival in a true ghost ship. Not the stuff of legend, but the stuff of nightmares, holding it together given his own power, commanding a crew of zombies, and reinforcing the whole all completely in his abilities in the Force. This kind of ability is unprecedented and little touched upon. There have been Sith Lords who have dominated the minds of armies, and those who have been able to lift ships, but for Nihilus to be able to make the Ravager space-worthy and hold it together for as long as he did, even doing so subconsciously, it was truly a feat in the Force on a monumental scale. Many often remember Force users for their abilities in combat, or the largest thing they are able to lift or obliterate. He made his terrible mark on the galaxy by his ability to consume other beings of their very life, leading up to the feeding of entire worlds. However, pure destructive power is one thing, but having such a refined control is another. The amount of mental domination and willpower displayed in keeping a vessel as large as the battlecruiser afloat and doing so perpetually is mind-boggling. It must be that when Nihilus became a wound in the Force, and as a result of the mass shadow generator, he felt a sort of connection with the Ravager. Both of them were severely wounded, considered dead, and their lives destroyed by this superweapon. But Nihilus himself gave the Ravager a second chance at life by raising it from the grave to serve his will. This bond with the ship and Nihilus had to be what made all of this possible. But anyway, my friends,
Darth Plagueis the Wise do the seemingly impossible? Could he heal the wounds of Lord Vader? Greetings, Acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the Archives. The first Sith Lord to have found the secret to manipulating the midichlorians, Plagueis, was a man whose work is largely misunderstood and shrouded in great mystery and darkness. His ability to create life through mastering the midichlorians was something that we have never seen before. It was Plagueis' goal to achieve immortality through this process, thereby eschewing the need for essence transfer or horrific rituals that would leave one in a state of agony. On the road to eternal life, Plagueis would find that many things could be done when influencing the midichlorians. Namely, Darth Plagueis learned the ability to replicate life itself and to heal brutal grave injuries. This naturally led us to wonder if it was entirely possible that had Plagueis been alive, would he have been able to restore Anakin after his burning on Mustafar? To do this, we quickly got to work on our research, looking up the scientific breakthroughs of Darth Plagueis in depth to see what he could have accomplished. And after searching, it is our belief that Plagueis would have been able to save Vader from his black armored fate. So join us today as we open a holocron and dig through the research journal of Darth Plagueis and explain exactly why and how he would have saved Vader in a way that Sidious never could have. As we know, the diagnosis of the Chosen One's fate was very problematic, having now all 4 of his limbs severed and sustained burns down to his organs. So much living tissue of Anakin's body had been utterly destroyed. Because midichlorians inhabit living cells, when a sufficient amount of those cells are irretrievably lost, it will cut the user's force potential down a few notches. Typically, a limb or a hand severed here or there doesn't cause too much of a drop in potential, since the count is insignificant. But in Anakin Skywalker's case, when that much organic tissue was lost, first his limbs, then the burning of his tissue, this resulted in a dramatic loss in midichlorians and thus potential. As it was stated, Anakin should have been able to become the most powerful Force wielder in history, but he was cut down to merely 80% of not his own power, but Palpatine's. While Sidious himself insisted that Vader's power blockages were mostly that of mental, we know that even if Vader were to bypass his emotional barriers, he would still never have the power that he should have had. And that's all thanks to Darth Sidious's mismanagement of Vader's treatment. Despite having all of the Darth Plagueis research notes, Sidious admitted that he didn't understand his master's work, and evidently never took the time to attempt to learn it. Plagueis had nearly mastered the way of influencing the midichlorians, successfully recreating life, and coming within a breath of achieving the immortality that all Sith desired. But Sidious never replicated his master's experiments, and didn't much care for the idea of manipulating the midichlorians. Instead, Sidious would use the research to fuel experiments in creating mutants and monsters, but nothing else. This turned out to be a massive mistake and a massive waste, as Plagueis' research could have saved the power of the Chosen One had Palpatine tried, and there was great power there that Palpatine never learned.
Let's assume for a moment that Plagueis made it to the events of Revenge of the Sith. We won't go into too much detail about a what-if scenario, as this video is not meant to be a fanfiction, but more so an exploration on this specific moment in history. Plagueis had a very different idea for how he was going to build his Sith Empire, and because of this, he would have managed the Clone Wars very differently. Let's say for a moment that Sidious didn't kill his master, but instead decided to imprison him, only bringing him out whenever it suited the Dark Lord's purposes. Everything goes as it normally would until we get to the Duel of Mustafar. Instead of flying Vader back to Coruscant where he would be mutilated further by machines and outdated technology, Sidious takes him to a secret Sith world where Plagueis is being held prisoner. Palpatine orders his former master to heal Vader, or else. So, from what we've learned, how does Plagueis do it? Looking into his research notes from his journal, we have discovered a certain section, one that convinces us beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Sith scientist has this taken care of, and has this mastered. Plagueis had originally tried the idea of a blood transfusion, but found the host's body native midichlorians that rejected the influx of foreign cells. His natural solution was not to introduce new midichlorians, but to impose his will on the midichlorians already present within any given subject. It would take incredible mental acuity, but Plagueis would succeed in the process of using the Force on a microscopic level. This is possible, as many Jedi Masters and Sith Lords had the ability to do the same, doing so in order to create holocrons. Those subatomic nudges in the Force are possible with extreme focus. Plagueis had achieved this focus by practicing on rodents and other small creatures with a basic amount of midichlorians, and he had found this process difficult at first, stating that his own native midichlorians were rejecting his attempts to force them into imposing their fellows, due to the fact that all midichlorians are linked by a universal mind. Plagueis' midichlorians turned against those of the small creatures. However, his will would soon supersede theirs, and he would successfully manipulate any given subject. Let's read now from what Plagueis says in his notes. Eventually I succeeded, first with small creatures, then with slaves purchased from the Hutts. I forced the midichlorians to override their natural life cycles. What I discovered is that these midichlorians could not die. Instead, they drew upon sustaining force energy, which acted on a microscopic level to halt tissue decay in their hosts, putting an end to aging and disease. With this knowledge, Plagueis would have been able to save Vader from dying, and even halted the destruction process of his body so it wouldn't get any worse. Later in Plagueis' notes though, the Sith scientists admittedly had trouble when it came to replicating the midichlorians. He had done it a few times with non-force sensitive subjects, but the results were catastrophic. The midichlorians had multiplied uncontrollably, and thus resulted in the death of the hosts. However, we know that in Darth Plagueis' novel, he had successfully done this with another Sith in Darth Venomous, as Plagueis was able to bring Venomous back to life over and over again at will. Plagueis was able to do it without trying, to the point where he was just having fun with it. With this knowledge, Plagueis would have easily been able to influence the midichlorians of Anakin's body to flood over the damaged tissue, restoring it all from the burns. It would likely be a grisly process, with Anakin's life hanging by a thread, but Plagueis could have done it. This would restore the damaged tissue, and not only his flesh, but his lungs as well, negating the need for a respirator, life support system, and a helmet, as this process would also likely restore Anakin's eyes, ears, and his vocal cords. It's possible that he might even be able to grow his hair back. But on the subject of Anakin's limbs, this is a little bit of a different story. Plagueis would not be able just to have Anakin regenerate his legs and arms. That would likely require a transfusion, which would be much more difficult, as the natural solution, of course, is cloning his limbs. In a holocron we released a few days ago though, we talked about why Vader didn't clone his limbs, with the reason largely being the fact that cloning force-sensitive tissue was extremely difficult. There was a risk in the limbs being unstable and not working with the Force properly due to how the midichlorians would act differently. However, only with Imperial science did Darth Vader find these weaknesses, not Darth Plagueis' eyes. With Plagueis, all of that worry is thrown out the window. The Sith was a mad scientist fully aware of the midichlorians' resistance to replication, and this is why we believe Plagueis would be able to use his abilities in tandem with the cloning process to ensure that the midichlorians obeyed and replicated properly. Then, he could surgically graft the limbs back onto Anakin's body, causing the cells to properly mend with one another to feel just as natural. We even believed that he could restore Anakin's right hand. But now, my friends, this is why we believe Plagueis could have completely restored Vader's body and his Force potential. It would have been long and grueling, but from the research notes of Darth Plagueis and the Darth Plagueis novel, we believe it to be more than possible. Something compelling though, is even though Vader would no longer have a suit, this process would be traumatic, and Vader could likely still pull upon that pain. Perhaps even Plagueis could offer Vader something else, perhaps attempting to bring Padme back as well. But that is a story for another day. As always, my friends, Kamino is known as the home of the clones, the soldiers that made up the Grand Army of the Republic. Ever since they were discovered by Plagueis, they were ground zero for the Sith's grand plan. Dooku would be the one to find Jango Fett, and then strike a bargain with the Camanoans after Sifo Dyas ordered the creation of the clone army. Ever since then, Kamino was the launching grounds for the troopers that would be the namesake of the Clone War. And before it became the barracks for the Jedi's army, what kind of planet was Kamino? What type of people were the Camanoans? Well, today, my friends, we are going to be exploring the ancient past up until now of the planet of Kamino, going through just about everything there is to know about this fascinating aquatic world. So, my friends, open up your traveler's guides and prepare for hyperspace, because into the waters of Kamino we go. The first interesting thing to note about Kamino is its actual location. You see, Kamino isn't actually in the known galaxy, but just slightly outside of it. If we were to look at a 3D map of the galaxy, Kamino wouldn't lie inside of the galactic disk or even outside of it, but rather above it. Following the Rishi Maze in the outer rim will lead you to a section of wild space which holds a dwarf satellite galaxy, one which is many times smaller than the wider galaxy we are familiar with. This dwarf galaxy is so small that it only really holds a handful of star systems in a single cluster. Within one of these star systems lies the planet of Kamino, a world which has largely been neutral, self-contained, and pretty insignificant to the wider universe for a while. Until the Camanoans developed cloning technology, they were largely left alone. But once they perfected cloning, the Republic were not the first ones to seek out their services. But before we get into cloning, we must discuss the mythological origins of Kamino. According to the tale of Awaha Pond, the world begins with a monster god known as Protoss, a being which was truly one of a kind. He was said to wield magical abilities and to be the strongest beast that ever lived on the world. With his immense power, he ruled the seas and every creature under the water. But soon, another beast would arise and issue a challenge to the monster god for rulership over the seas. This creature was named Melkor, a dark titan dwelling in the deepest reaches of the ocean. Protoss accepted the challenge and met Melkor at the ridge of Thylina. The battle commenced and ensued for days on end, the combatants violently thrashing away at one another, wrestling and grappling, hoping to gain the advantage. Melkor sought to use both his power and size to overcome Protoss, but the monster god was too quick and agile. 7 whole days of combat would go by, the very seas themselves being rocked by the fierce struggle, until Melkor began to grow tired. Immediately, Protoss turned the tables on the dark monster and rushed him, ending his life there. It was said that Melkor's blood stained the ocean, providing food for the creatures of the sea for an entire eon. The god Protoss continued to be the king of the seas for a little while longer, until he was met with another challenge, a group of Kikla swimmers, who despite being small in stature, were great in number. They too challenged Protoss in full confidence that they could defeat him, believing their multitudes to be too great. With the Killik swimming all over Protoss, hoping their numbers would give them longevity and dominance. However, Protoss was considerably more focused than the Kikla, and they were quarrelsome and unable to unify for a dedicated attack against the god. Their bites hardly wounded Protoss at all, and he was able to successfully divide his opponents before eating them. The god of the seas successful again. The nutrition from the consumed Kikla continued to give the sea god strength as he fought what remained, and by the time the new moon rose, he had eaten the last of their number. Still, Protoss was king. Time passed, and by now, Protoss had grown old and arrogant. He knew that none could oppose him as he wielded his power freely. He would soon, though, come across a pod of migration, known of the Iowa. These flying creatures that we would later see the Camanoans ride. They were heading south for the winter, as was their custom. Yet, Protoss blocked their way and decreed that they should return north where they would freeze and die. The god's reasoning? Nothing more than it would amuse him to watch them all perish. The Iowa discussed this matter amongst themselves, and then, without issuing a challenge as the others had done, they suddenly attacked Protoss. Initially, the Iowa swarmed Protoss in much the same way that the Kikla had, and in turn, Protoss scattered them, forcing the Iowa to adopt a new tactic. Evoking Melkor, they attempted to tear at Protoss' flesh with their jaws, and despite the fact that they lacked the size of Melkor, they made up for it with their fierceness. Furthermore, they had a determination and unity that the Kikla had lacked, and so in turn, Protoss began to bleed. However, the monster god endured, and the Iowa were unable to conquer him. When Protoss exposed his soft and vulnerable neck though, one of the Iowa spotted it, and they charged and clamped down on it hard. The monster god bellowed out in pain as he felt his life force dissipating and would surely die. Using his fins, he thrashed at the lone Iowa in a punitive attempt, but it was too late. Although the lone Iowa was slain, his allies organized for one decisive final attack, and Protoss was finally killed. In the aftermath of the monster god's death, the Iowa ruled the oceans of Kamino and were respected by all for the defeat of the god, in spite of the fact that they desired no glory whatsoever and only pursued self-preservation. This amazing mythological tale would be passed down through Camanoan heritage for generations, and would be the basis of what the people would come to believe. Power through unity and preservation. Despite the oceans being the mainstay for Kamino, the planet was not always fully aquatic. It used to have dry land, and even marshlands. Some of these marshlands still exist today, but they're quite rare. But back in the ancient days, sometime prior to 19,000 BBY, Kamino was ironically mostly landlocked, with eels choking its narrow oceans and sleet-skinned mammals inhabiting the marshlands of the lower-lying continents. It was for these particular mammals that the Camanoans would eventually arise and evolve. The Camanoans exhibited effortless survival and movement in both land and water. In the beginning, they built massive cities on the coasts, with the largest and most popular being the city of Derem. Within the city, they built fantastic structures such as the cloak spires of Harien Nova, but soon, all of them would become buried in the tragedy of 19,000 BBY, as an abrupt climate change suddenly caused the mass melting of Kamino's glacial reserves. Within 200 years, every landmass of Kamino was buried in hundreds of meters of water. The Camanoans wasted no time during those 2 precious centuries though. Armed by the values given to them by the tale of Iowa Pond, they preserved and built cities on stilts in this brave new era. With their brilliant minds, the Camanoans would advance their technology until they reached perfection in the cloning science. Using this technology, they were able to clone the extinct species that had drowned in the wake of the mass climate catastrophe. In the wake of the Great Flood, the people used this technology to even clone their own species to ensure their survival. This would lead to their culture becoming more and more uniformity and reaching perfection. Soon, Camanoan cloning was the finest in the galaxy, beating out literally all other competition. People would come from all around, commissioning their cloning services to create workers or even soldiers for warlords. Although the Camanoans were highly xenophobic, they reluctantly complied with working with outsiders so that they could trade their cloning services for necessary imported supplies and goods. And speaking of the Camanoans themselves, they were mostly defined by their slender appearance, calm and pleasant demeanor, and their long necks. But while these are the things that humans and other species would notice first, the Camanoans were more focused on the eyes of their brethren. The large eyes of their heads were usually dark and were suited for seeing in the murky depths of the water. They could see on the ultraviolet spectrum, which is actually why Tipoca City is completely white on the interior. In fact, this only appears white to humans and many other species, and the colors of the interior are painted with an ultraviolet spectrum and can only be seen and admired by the Camanoans. But it was the actual eye color of their people that mattered to them the most. Whatever color their members were born with determined their caste that they would eventually be placed in. The highest level caste had gray eyes, and they served as administrators and operators of the facility. The middle caste were the golden eyes, and the lowest castes had blue eyes. The castes determined not only their social ranking, but also the job that they would have on Kamino. What's fascinating is some Kaminoans were born with green eyes. However, they were viewed with disdain and were killed shortly after birth, viewed as an abomination. The Kaminoans hated anything less than perfection and constantly strived towards it. This is why they moved with such elegance and grace and spoke so softly. They believed themselves to be the pinnacle of beings and viewed all other beings as lesser. Though they did respect any being that tried to improve themselves. Any species that refused to improve, though, they saw as worthless and garbage. However, despite their intense xenophobia, they were always polite to outsiders, mostly because they took such great pride in their scientific exploits and advancements. Since their cities were mostly made of giant laboratories and facilities, the Kaminoans sank themselves into their work in perfecting the cloning science. They were a reserved people that rarely showed their true emotions. When they did, it was in a dance known as the Nahara that simulated a ballet. Although force sensitivity was extremely rare in the Kaminoans, and to our knowledge there was only one of their species that became a Jedi. Master Kinha was a Kaminoan who became a Jedi during the Republic Classic era before the Clone Wars. She was a wise master who strictly adhered to the code of the Jedi, but rarely ever visited the temple. It was because of this distance from the main Jedi Order that she managed to survive Order 66, hiding out on Mandalore during the reign of the Empire. The Kaminoans, though, viewed Kinha as a monster since she could touch the Force and none of them could, viewing this as a breach of perfection. The end of Kamino's history and the collapse of Kaminoan society happened at different periods depending on which continuity you explore. In canon, the Bad Batch explored how the Empire secretly ordered the bombardment of Tipoca City to fully end the Clone Trooper project. While many Kaminoans died, others were given offers to join the Empire and use their experience and scientific knowledge to serve the Emperor. In Legends, the end came in 12 BBY, when some disgruntled Kaminoan scientists attempted to revolt, making a counter-clone army to fight the Empire. The 501st was sent in, led by Boba Fett, in order to shut down the entire operation. During the battle, almost all of the Kaminoan cloning facilities were destroyed, and many of them were massacred. In 4 ABY, Kaminoan society tragically collapsed after the fall of the Empire. Though many were still around and would end up helping out during the Yuzhong Vong War, this would be the end for most of Kaminoan culture. But anyway, my friends, greetings, acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. Among the vast expanses of the galaxy and the trillions of planets that lie within it, we are all aware that some of these systems are far more dangerous than others, whether due to inhospitable weather, environments, or even something more mystical and Force-related. There are just some places that you do not want to visit. But today, we are not actually going to be talking about a dangerous planet as we usually do, but rather, we are here to discuss the deadliest moon in all of Star Wars lore. Duxun, also known as the Demon Moon, is a vicious and hostile place that in some cases outshines even planets in how dangerous it is. Ironically, despite its infamous reputation, it is an important site for some of the most titular moments in all of galactic history, in particular having to do with the Mandalorians. However, eventually the Sith would come to claim this moon as one of their favorite places to visit. As we update our holocrons and star maps with each and every day, we want to ensure that all of the spacefarers passing through here will get a fair chance at learning when we upload. So if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button so that you too will be prepared for all of your travels. Now, acolytes, let us begin. Duxun is the largest moon orbiting the planet of Onderon. It's so big in fact that many consider it to actually be something like a twin planetoid.
Duxun also orbits so closely to Onderon that once a year in the summer, their atmospheres will actually briefly merge into one, information that will be important later. But what makes Duxun so spectacularly dangerous is the native jungle and all of its inhabitants, plus the fact that the entire moon is steeped in the dark side of the Force. Ironically, the moon itself has a rather livable and temperate climate, one that can support the lush jungle biome, mirroring the forest moon of Endor in a very similar way. What makes Duxun so deadly is actually the predatory species that live there. There are many that prey on unsuspecting visitors like the small and conniving bomas, or the large, armored Zak eggs. However, two of the most prevalent and deadly creatures are the Drexels and the Malaras. The species known as the Malaras were quadruple red predators with razor-sharp claws and massive teeth. They usually had red skin and long, lizard-like tails with stinger barbs on the end of them that leaked powerful acid. But this wasn't nearly the worst part about them. Malaras were force sensitive and could use the force to cloak themselves. They were able to use a chameleon effect for the active camouflage, and they could hide their force signature to the point where only a highly trained Jedi or Sith could perceive their vague presence. Darth Bane himself would actually face off against one of them and one of these predators during his visit to the moon, and the duel was no small feat for even one of the greatest Dark Lords. Drexels, on the other hand, were massive winged beasts that were a cross between avian and reptilian in nature. They had faces like spiders with multiple eyes and fangs the length of a human arm. Their wingspan averaged about 20 meters in diameter, and some were known to grow to the size of even krayt dragons. These beasts were actually the titular monsters that began the event known as the Beast Wars of Onderon, as riders trained and mounted these winged monsters and were able to ride them between the atmospheres of Duxun and Onderon whenever they met in the summertime. What began the Beast Wars was the Drexels migrating from Duxun to Onderon when they began eating the native people there, since the humans were plentiful food source on the world. Essentially, a dark side alien invasion of brutal war beasts. At the time, the native Onderonians lived in walled cities, and they used what technology they had to fend off the Drexels. Their capital punishment at the time was to send criminals out of the wall to fend for themselves against the beasts. An especially cruel punishment that would backfire, as all the criminals banded together in their own faction and actually managed to domesticate the Drexels, using the creatures as war mounts to wage war on the Onderonians that had shunned them away. This is the very beginning of the Beast Wars of Onderon. It was also said that the Sith Lord Friedan Nad had a hand in these beasts, as he liked to experiment on them and using Sith alchemy. After Friedan Nad's death, Jedi Master Akra Jeth would take the sarcophagus and have it buried on the moon of Duxun, as it continued to permeate and poison the very moon. After centuries, the dangerous moon would continue to draw in people of a violent nature, the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, who would set up a base camp there during the old Sith Wars. But after the defeat of their leader, Mandalore the Indomitable, his escape attempt would be halted as he was shocked down on the moon of Duxun. It was there that Mandalore was eaten alive by the moon's savage beasts. His mask would later be found by another Mandalorian who took up the mantle as Mandalore. But the Mandalorians were not done with Duxun. Many years later, the Mandalorians would return to the moon and make it their primary base of operations under Mandalore the Ultimate. This is where Mandalore the Ultimate would reside during the Mandalorian Wars, in which Revan actively participated in. And it was on the moon of Duxun where Revan and Mitra Surik led an all-out assault on the fortress of the Mandalorians, a battle which proved to be the bloodiest of the entire war. The Mandalorians had highly upgraded their headquarters with all sorts of minefields and explosives, which cost the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of Republic troopers. The casualties that day were horrific, as Revan and Mitra were forced to order their troops into suicidal forward charges straight into the minefields of the Mandalorians, a last-ditch attempt to break the defenses of the fortress. Though the Jedi did win the day, it was said that for every Mandalorian death, there were 10 Republic deaths. Sometime later, Mitra Surik was forced to return to the site of one of her greatest military failures, when she was aiding Candoris Ordo with the Mandalorian Civil War during the time of the war against the Sith Lord Darth Nihilus. Many more centuries would pass, and Duxun would become famous among the Sith for its well of dark side energies, amplified due to the fact that this was the final resting place of Friedan Nad's sarcophagus. It became popular for the Sith to bring their apprentices on a pilgrimage to the moon for their dark side training. Even Sith had field trips of their own. This became tradition, as Darth Bane himself took Darth Zana there, though he actually would leave her on Onderon to fend for herself while he went searching for Duxun and Freedon Nad's lost holocron. It would be on the world of Duxun where Bane would acquire his famous Orbalisk armor, as it was Nad's tomb that contained the vile creatures that were native to the moon. Bane's ship would be destroyed upon entering Duxun, so to return to Onderon, Bane used the dark side to command the minds of the Draxel and ride it through the merging atmospheres of the planetoids, like the old Beast Riders did. It was after this that Bane got to test out his new Orbalisk armor by getting into a skirmish with a group of Beast Riders that had attempted to kidnap Zana. Needless to say, Darth Bane butchered them all. But anyway, my friends and acolytes, this was the deadly history of the moon known as Duxun, and the moon that the Sith loved to visit. I hope you enjoyed this lore breakdown, and if there are any other planets or places in the general Star Wars lore that you would like to hear us talk about and create a holocron, be sure to comment down below what you would like to see highlighted in future lore. As always, may the Force be with you, and I hope that you're having a great day.